Good evening. This is a meeting of the South Kingstown Planning Board, a regular session. The date is Thursday, May 30th, 2024. The time is 6:37 p.m. The first item on our agenda is roll call. Joe Murphy. Here. Susan Axelrod. Here. Robin Pothier.
Here.
Liz Karp. Here. Caper Wilson. Here. Peter DiStefano is absent, and Maria Mack is here. Our next agenda item is the consent agenda. This consists of approval minutes from April 9th, 2024 Planning Board work session, April 23rd, 2024 Planning Board regular session, and the report of the administrative officer. If there are no corrections or additions, would someone like to make a motion to approve the consent agenda?
I might suggest a few corrections.
Go ahead.
On the April 9th, item D, regulatory changes. It says that it passed by unanimous vote, but I do believe that Peter voted nay on that.
We can check the record, Madam Chair.
Okay, so we will hold those. Anything else?
Not for April 9th, I'm fine.
Anything else from anyone?
Well, I have something on the next.
Go ahead.
Shall we do that now? I'm just a little unsure of how this legal document is used. I understand that keeping the minutes is a legal issue, but sometimes it's kind of vague. And so, if someone were to ask for records of a meeting, are they given the minutes? Are they, for instance, on the third page, after the 5-minute break, in that second paragraph in item B, so it's lightly referred to as and enforcement being a burden on neighbors. I'm not sure if someone reading this in the future would have any idea what we're talking about there. And I think it might be lost to the record that it was brought to light in that meeting that this applicant was here because they had already been not obeying the zoning ordinance. And that fact might get lost. And 3 years from now, when they're before the board again, where does that come to light?
I defer to legal counsel on that one.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, as far as what's legally required for the minutes, all that is required are the members present, the item that's being voted on, and the result of any vote. So, any additional details can be added, and if a member of the board makes a motion to add it, that can always be provided. You can never get all the detail into the minutes, though. But I think what also is a public record that someone could go back and look at if they had a concern about any particular meeting is they'd have access to the video. The meetings are being taped, so they could watch the tape of the meeting, or they could listen to the audio recording.
And the problem with that is that sometimes the audio recording isn't very good. We've already admitted that.
Yeah, so, really the only gold standard that you could have would be if you had a stenographer for every item, but short of that, the minutes of the meeting, there's always going to be certain things that you're not going to pick up, since you are trying to summarize rather than write verbatim.
So I guess my question to the board then is, how valuable do we find the minutes? How accurate do we want them to be?
Robin, I think that we have the opportunity to add to the minutes if need be. Sometimes they are relatively brief. As you'll see in some of these, it says discussion ensued without going into every detail about who said what. So it's really up to if the board is concerned with the level of detail without becoming a 10-page document. I think it's up to the board to bring that up.
So do we want to make a motion then that further information is included in item B, that this board was hearing this proposal because of already non-compliance with our zoning ordinance?
It seems to me that in this case, anybody that goes back and looks in the record and all the submissions would probably be aware of that. Jamie, do you have any?
I certainly wasn't aware of that until I asked the question.
To reinforce what Peter said, the meeting minutes are not intended to be a transcript of what transpires. In fact, if there's litigation associated with anything that you do with regards to approval, denial, or a proceeding, the courts are going to require an official transcript. The meeting minutes are only a part of what you do. They're not intended to be verbatim. To entertain a motion to include something wouldn't necessarily be completely factual, because we couldn't include something based on a statement tonight. We would actually have to go back, listen to the tape, and we can only put what's on the tape. We can't add or subtract or put an interpretation of what was said. The meeting minutes, again, are intended to be a summary, so I would support what counsel's saying, that there are two redundant potential records, and that is the recording and the video of the meeting, which are intended to supplement the meeting minutes. I will agree with Robin on one part, that in some instances, a video recording could fail and a digital recording could fail or not be always intelligible with regards to hearing everything. We have members of the mic who step away and then the recording doesn't pick it up. But if there were any motion, it would be to look at a specific section of the meeting minutes, and based on what was, I don't know what we would add or subtract.
Well, I do agree with Robin that this is quite brief relative to this particular item, and I think it would be helpful to go back and add a couple of sentences regarding the non-compliance and that whole conversation, because obviously this is a type of application that is coming before us on a regular basis, and it would be, I think, helpful for anyone who is interested to be able to understand that going back to the minutes. So in this particular case, I would agree. Caper?
I was simply going to say that an alternative might be, when it comes time to vote, the person who has the question could note that there was a concern about that particular issue, because there's really a philosophy here about how detailed you want your minutes to be. And it's very difficult, I think, to have minutes be a verbatim record of the conversation. That's asking way too much of everyone, and it seems unnecessarily duplicative when we have video recordings. So there are several different ways of addressing the issue, and I certainly respect the point.
Right, and verbatim is over the top. I'm not saying that, but, what if 10 years go by? Nobody on this board might even recall this conversation.
No, I totally respect that. The problem is, you have a philosophy about minutes. Are they going to be, shall we say, categorical, or are they going to be detailed? And it's difficult to be detailed in one instance, but not in others.
And I do think that since these were quite brief, we can probably find a happy medium that allows for some degree of practicality, but also the greatest degree possible of transparency. So
I think that makes sense.
Generally, when we make suggestions or we try to incorporate public comment into the minutes, we generally try to briefly touch on what was said, not necessarily exactly what was said. And again, there is a fine line there, and sometimes, when the person doing the minutes, you're trying to capture the temperature and the flavor of the discussion, and you're typing along a certain way. And what's really important is when those public comments become factual to a point where where the board is using them one way or another, then they need to be identified and referenced specifically as a finding that you're possibly basing a decision on or taking into consideration among other items to guide you in that regard. I would encourage the board, if it's desire of the board to have more detailed minutes, I don't believe staff has the capability. I mean, I'll speak for everyone. I don't believe we have the capability of doing that. We service 7 different boards that we do minutes for. And understand the context of all the boards is quite different, but it is very difficult to produce minutes, to take notes and produce minutes while doing all the other administrative day-to-day tasks. So it is something that we struggle with. It's not just SK, every municipality struggles with it because it's just a resource issue. It's a staffing issue.
I think we understand it, but in this case, it really is essentially one sentence. So
Yeah, and it
would
wasn't
be
public
helpful.
comment, it was Peter and myself's conversation. And as I read, and enforcement being a burden on neighbors, I think sounds pretty meaningless. Who knows what we're talking about there?
So could the board agree then that we will pull the April 9th, 2024 work session to check on the vote and pull the April 23rd, 2024 regular session to add some language to better describe the conversation, which leaves us with the report of the administrative officer. So would someone like to make that motion?
Just before you entertain the motion, so your intent tonight is to pull them off the consent agenda so you can discuss them further?
No, so that staff is going to check on the vote for the April 9th and look at better defining the conversation from the April 23rd within reasonable limits.
Okay, thank you for the clarity.
So would someone like to make a motion?
So I'll make a motion. So are we approving the minutes with
No.
the assumption that they'll be adjusted, or we
No.
revisit them?
Revisit.
Okay. So I'll make a motion that we, on the consent agenda, we approve the administrative officer report alone.
We have a motion from Susan. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Second from Liz. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Motion carries. Next agenda item, a public hearing continued from January 23rd, 2024, preliminary plan review, major subdivision comprehensive permit, Fieldstone Farm. We have a request from the applicant for a continuance of this public hearing to the Tuesday, June 25th, Planning Board regular session meeting. Would someone like to make that motion? We have a motion.
But before I do, I just want to make sure that we've gotten a corresponding extension for review to match with the extension they've
Good
requested.
question.
Yes, the applicant has agreed to extend the timeframe and to put this off into June. Staff encouraged and they agreed that they will renotice this meeting, this public hearing, as if it were a new application at that time, given the amount of continuations and the time that has passed since the original. So that is also, that will also be done before that next meeting.
Before we entertain a motion, I'd like to know if there are any members of the public who are here to speak to that point, that issue.
Is there anyone here for Fieldstone Farm? Fortunately, it was on the agenda that the applicant had requested a continuance, so we hope.
So I'll make the motion to continue the Fieldstone Farms to our next regular scheduled meeting, which is in June.
June 25th, correct? It needs to be a date certain. Do we have a second?
Second.
Second from Caper. Is there further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Motion carries. Our next agenda item is a public hearing continued from April 23rd, 2024, major multi-household land development project, conceptual master plan review, Green Street Manor. Is there anyone representing the applicant?
Hello, Chair Mack, members of the board. Good to see you tonight. James Callahan of Callahan & Callahan, 3 Brown Street. Here tonight again on behalf of Johnny Cake Center for Hope. With me again tonight is Kate Brewster, CEO of Johnny Cake, Ed Wojcik of Wojcik Architects, and Molly Titus of Dupree Engineering. As you recall, we were here last month, I believe, for conceptual master plan approval for 12 Green Street. Since then, we've had many discussions to move forward these plans and address our concerns. Kate Brewster did provide a letter dated May 23rd regarding a number of issues that were raised, including deed restriction that we reviewed for the property. There are no deed restrictions on the property that currently exist. Documentation of Green Street. Mr. Wagner and Mr. Yunkin from HDC went to the site and photographed and documented the Green Street property. Also, building measurements were provided electronically. We discussed the center doorway elimination that was brought up at some point, but we don't think that that's a positive move for this building because the door serves as one of 2 points of egress to the second-story unit, and it presents an unnecessary hazard. And Mr. Wojcik has repeatedly said he's attempting to design the building very much in the same form and architecture that it is currently. Again, we addressed the parking issue in the letter in that there was a suggestion that parking could be put on the street, on Green Street, but neighbors, at least 2 neighbors, and the owners, Johnny Cake Center, did not believe that's a well-thought-out option due to the size of Green Street. Additionally, we addressed the 106 review of HUD vouchers, and again, we just want to reiterate, this is a project that was fully privately funded. In the future, if there's some issue with federal assistance for Section 8 vouchers, Johnny Cake Center can simply rent these properties for lower than the market rate, and that is the plan here. So this project is a benefit to people who don't have housing, to Johnny Cake Center, and the town of South Kingstown. It's a tremendous project. It's, again, fully privately funded. I mean, I think this is, if this thing fell out of the sky into South Kingston's lap, they would say, thank God. But we've been through a few hoops here, and we hope that, at least for this stage in the master plan, conceptual plan, we've given you what you've asked, and we're happy to answer any other questions. But I think basically based on the letter and what we presented last time, we hope that you approve the conceptual plan tonight. Thank you.
I would like to add that we received some letters of support from Gary and Wes Lassard, Robert, Don Francesco, and Chuck Comiskey for the project. And Mr. Callahan, are there any revisions that you're bringing forward this evening?
Yes, the one revision we have is that the waivers we requested include one waiver we've asked for is open space. We are withdrawing that request because we meet the open space requirements. We're going to deed restrict that instead of asking for the waiver. But we still are asking for the waivers listed in the staff report: landscape screening, commercial zone abutting residential district, and the parking lot be permitted 3 feet from the building wall, and also the variance for the commercial zoning district abutting the residential zone, which is unavoidable, obviously, based on the location. So that's the only amendment we have at this point.
Madam Chair, one question of Mr. Callahan. Along with your waiver request for open space, has any of the site plans been adjusted to show that calculation of where that open space is going to be?
I believe it is shown on the site in the.
You have it, Jay? No? Okay.
Molly can speak to that.
It's with my understanding that the planning board intends to at least close the hearing tonight, so I just want to make sure we have that appropriate information on the record.
Trying to figure out exactly what the direction is, but it's the green space on the bottom of the.
Yeah.
I have a pointer, I'm sorry.
No, I don't either. Yeah, so the plan south,
Please state your name for the record first. Thank you.
Molly Titus, Deprete Engineering. So all the way to the south, between the building and the neighbor, that area, proposed open space, and then the square footage is listed, and the calculation is on the development table on the top right of the plans.
Thank you, Molly. So just for clarity, it is the rectangle bisected by the X? That's, okay, thank you.
That's correct.
Questions from board members? Anything from staff?
Just one point of clarification. On the parking, it was staff's suggestion that it was not put on the street, but it was located internal to the property, but in a parallel parking scenario, so that staff did not imply that the cross-section of the road would change, but that there would be internal to the site parallel parking, not on the street parking, which would modify the cross-section. But we understand that what the Johnny Cake wants to do works from a traffic standpoint, turning radiuses. We put the AASHTO and ITE turning templates on it, and all of those spaces proposed do work.
We also have a memo on the HDC advisory opinion, and I believe that in our staff comments, there is agreement from the applicant that they will allow the HDC to do some sort of a recording of the existing structure.
Madam Chair, that actually occurred.
Yes, Mr.
That's
So
Youngkin.
they have already done that
Mr. Youngkin and Mr. Wagner went to the site last week, 2 weeks ago?
last week.
Yeah, 2 Fridays ago.
Okay.
There's one additional piece of information I think staff would weigh in on, and I understand Mr. Callahan's position potentially clarified some things with regards to the 106 review with regards to federal funding. Mr. Wagner did have an opportunity to speak with the authorities within the state of Rhode Island and can weigh in a little bit on that, but I'm going to summarize what Mr. Callahan said tonight, that devoid of any issues associated with the 106 review that may jeopardize the applicant's funding, financing ability to rent this to someone within the state or federal voucher system. If there was an issue associated with that, they would just revert their financial and structural plan to have it straight rental outside of that program. Is that a fair summary?
Right. I think the goal here is to provide housing at an affordable rate for families in the South County area, whether it's through federal housing or through Johnny Cake itself. There's really, their goal is to provide housing in this fashion, regardless of whether there's federal funds through Section 8. So I think that's a noble cause, and to find that around the state is difficult, and I think that should be commended.
Yes, I don't think it's up to this board to require or define whatever mechanism the applicant decides to utilize, but important that we understand the situation.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So, Mr. Callahan, if I could ask you a question, because I don't know much about how this works, could you explain to me the lapse of the deed restriction and why there wouldn't be a deed restriction moving forward on these units?
Right, so there was a deed restriction that was recorded back in 2000 for the prior owner, which was the South County Emergency Shelter Incorporated recipient. They had a deed restriction for their rental that lasts for 20 years. That expired on May 8th, 2020. I have the restriction here. So when that expired, I think Johnny Cake already bought the... They bought it after, it's correct. So the restriction had ended. So that's not applicable here anymore. As a new owner, there's no mortgage from the South County Emergency Shelter in place. That would potentially extend it, or if it was foreclosed, that would extend the restriction. That did not occur. The new owners is Johnny Cake, and there's no rental restrictions. And again, quite frankly, it doesn't matter if there was, because Johnny Cake is not going to turn around and sell this to the highest bidder. This is the Johnny Cake Center's property, and they're going to use it for the purpose of providing affordable housing, whether it's federally funded, locally funded, or privately funded, which is probably the case.
Thank you. And not to sound too cynical, but they could.
Yeah, they could.
And
They could.
so I guess, considering a holistic issue with our town and our lack of deed-restricted affordable housing, is this something that they would revisit? Because we do need, registered affordable housing in our town. Like, why wouldn't it, I don't understand why it wouldn't be registered as deed-restricted affordable housing if that were the intent for the property.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to speak for Kate, but I think Johnny Cake's been around since 1972, doing things to the community beyond and above.
Oh, I
any
didn't
other
mean to sound like
community.
I was accusing.
I know, but it's,
Kate Brewster from the Johnny Cake Center. I think the real issue is that we are going to seek private financing, and so until we have explored all those options, we don't want to tie our hands to the deed restriction, which essentially would lower the value of the property. So down the road, once we're complete, we will look and decide as an organization whether that's something that we want to do. But I think for now, leaving it unrestricted puts us in a much better position as we seek financing.
Thank you. Liz?
Just a really general question. Is there any concept for how that open space is going to be used?
we think it's just going to be play area for children on
Okay.
the site.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments from board members? Brian?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify some of the information that I learned regarding the comments made by Richard Youngkin at the last meeting about the Section 108 vouchers. In my discussions with the state and HUD, the state pointed out that this is also a state-registered historic district. So if there are any state funds involved in this project, including Rhode Island housing money or ARPA money that flowed through the state, this would be subject to a state review. So in case any of that's happening, I want to point that out to you and make sure that you contact the state about that. The last thing I want to happen is see the building demolished and then the project hit a dead end because of financing. The other thing that the HUD representatives pointed out is that there are different kinds of vouchers, a property-based voucher and a tenant-based voucher. With the property-based vouchers, the voucher stays with the property and it goes with the property owner. And because of that, it is considered to be a financing instrument, and it does trigger a 106 review, absolutely. So if at any point in time in seeking private financing, they pursue these property-based vouchers, that will trigger a 106 review, and if the building is already gone, that will be considered to be an anticipatory demolition, and they may be banned from that voucher program.
Kate Brewster again, if I can just address that. We really don't have any intent ever to use project-based vouchers at this point. It's kind of a much more complicated system in terms of selecting tenants. We would have to go through a local housing authority and not have the same discretion that we would to use vouchers from any part of the state. So that's not the intent. It really is to have voucher choice, portable vouchers from the federal government that go with the person, not the property. So I want to be very clear about that. We've talked about this in the past, and that's not something that we're looking at. I did include in the letter that I sent some regulations from HUD that suggest that the vouchers are excluded in terms of federal funding for purposes of 106 review.
Thank you.
And Madam Chair, just as a follow-up, and from staff's perspective, this is not an intent to stop a project or anything. We just wanted to be clear in our review and our diligence. And if we knew that something could possibly affect financing, we wanted to point that out to you. And I think, through council as well as you, Ms. Brewster, as the applicant, are going to vet this thoroughly as it moves on. But again, this is a building that potentially could be full market rate. We know the intent of the Johnny Cake Center and what they do for this community, so we fully believe and support their intent to rent this below market rate. But again, we just wanted to point that out as a potential hurdle in the future so that they're aware of it when we became aware of it. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. All good information. This is a National Register property, and therefore your research is important to the board. Any other comments?
One more question.
Go ahead, Susan.
So we have a letter here from March 1st from the Johnny Cake Center indicating that architectural design elements will be appropriate to the neighborhood, porches, roof gables. Do you have a rendering of precisely what is planned for this space? And do we get to revisit this after public comment closes? So it's now, we need to talk about this? Yes, okay.
And just as around, we're only at master plan here, so we're going to come back before you again. And Ed Wojcik is here. We didn't go as far as elevations for this project because we don't want to get that far along financially until we're there. But I think we do have some elevations.
You did, just for clarity, Ed provided basic schematics with regards to elevations. My understanding through Kate's, Ms. Brewster's letter, that they will be supplementing the record with regards to those, primarily looking at the front entrances and how they correspond and relate to the historic nature of the area. So you do not have revised plans this evening, but I see their letter that they submitted for the record tonight as a commitment to make revisions to address the planning board's concerns moving forward.
Okay, thank you.
Is there anyone else who wishes to speak?
I
Go
just
ahead,
have
Liz.
one question, and it's really to the board. How are we documenting the existing building? I know measurement dimensions were taken. Are we photographing it as well?
Yeah, so that's what Richard and I did a couple of Fridays ago. We both went over. Johnny Cake opened up all 4 apartments for us, and we went through and took pictures from the second floor to the basement in all 4 units. And we have the measured drawings from Johnny Cake's architect, Mr. Wojcik, to go along with those. And we're going to create a package. And I think the goal is to home them over with the South County History Center.
Thank you.
I'll just,
Go ahead.
just a comment. I think that this is a very good project presented by a very good organization. It does a lot for the community. In an ideal sense, I would have loved to have seen a slightly higher density with smaller units, but I also trust that the Johnny Cake Center knows what the need is and what they're trying to solve. It would be nice if this was a deed restricted. It would give some credit towards to the town and provide some assurance, but that's a nice to have, not a required to have. Even if this was being presented by a private party at market rates, I still would be voting positive for this because I think it adds some needed housing in an area that's well suited for it, and also the fact that they're, what I think, significantly upgrading the area. So those are my comments.
Thanks, Joe. And also 4 units is under the threshold for inclusionary zoning. If there is no one else who wishes to speak, I would entertain a motion to close the public hearing.
Just, Madam Chair, before you do that, just
Yes.
for clarity, so the applicant understands, once the hearings close, in essence, the record is closed, the applicant does not have an opportunity to supplement the record, and then the commission will enter into their deliberation and motion formation.
Thanks, Jamie. Would someone like to make the motion to close the public hearing? So moved. We have a motion from Joe. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Second from Liz. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye.
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 Motion carries. So I believe the sentiment of the board is to ask staff to draft a motion for approval. It seems as though certain information relative to the register status and some of the conversation tonight, is that something, Peter, that you think should be either in our findings or in any kind of preface to a motion?
Regarding whether or not they have deed-restricted units on,
Well,
I'm sorry.
no, relative to the conversation about the National Register status, and that the board has been made aware that they may be unable to secure certain types of federal and/or state funding without a 106 review.
I don't think that needs to be in your decision. You could have it as just a preface that the discussion occurred, but as to your findings, that's ultimately just
Findings.
that's a private matter for the Johnny Cake Center to decide whether they want to not risk losing that funding or whether they want to proceed and take the chance. So that's really up to them.
And of course, this is master plan, and they will be back at preliminary with a greater level of detail in terms of architecture and anything else that is necessary. Comments with regard to anything that board members feel need to be included in the motion? Other than the obvious delineation of open space, all the normal things. And we will have an opportunity to read that motion and make any adjustments that the board members feel are necessary.
So, Madam Chair, we would go through our standard diligence with regards to preparing a motion. We will work with counsel on any wording associated with the preface to the findings and any conditions attached. I think what Maria, as the chair, is asking, is there anything beyond, we'll say, our standard norm that you feel is important for staff to evaluate and put into a motion?
Susan?
So I have a question. So one of the waivers was for screening for the parking area. But there is some space there that some sort of screening could be installed. By approving it this way with that waiver, does that mean we're also not asking them to give it the good college try to screen that space as well as they can? Like, does that need to be articulated in a motion, or by giving them a waiver for that, are we also giving them a pass on making an effort to screen that parking area?
I think, and counsel can correct me if I misspeak, in your waiver authority, you could set the standard for which you're waiving that. So are you, in essence, are you waiving every aspect associated with the buffer, or are you allowing them to move on to the preliminary phase, requiring them to give you additional detail on a alternative to our traditional standard landscape buffer? So I think you have some ability to not just carte blanche waive it, but to put some parameters for your expectations at preliminary.
Could we, Jamie, do as a condition of approval that the applicant work with the administrative officer, and the administrative officer just come to an agreement on what is practical for the area?
Again, we could work language into a draft motion to that effect.
Yeah, and just for clarity, this will be coming back for preliminary for the meat and potatoes.
I was
of the
just gonna say
approval.
that.
So it would really be
At that point?
a recommendation to the applicant that there's an expectation at preliminary that there be some, define it however you want, landscaping in that area to establish a buffer.
Again, to expand on Jay's point, I think what we're trying to clarity that if you make the motion to waive in a few months, you don't want them to come back to you and have a question about buffering or waiver or softening, and they come back to you and say, well, you waived it, therefore we're not responsible to do it. So I think hearing concerns from at least 2 members this evening, that we can put some language in the waiver provisions to address that, which
Thank you.
will be looked at preliminary.
So the second waiver was
We'll put
just,
some guardrails on the waiver request.
so at this point, there's only 2 waivers. There's the buffering for the parking area, and then there's also the distance between the parking area and the building itself. Are those the only 2 waivers that are now outstanding? Because the open space one's been addressed.
If you
I don't have that
just
motion
bear
in
with
front of me.
me. Yeah, I think we are down to the 2 waivers. So again, we will clarify that in any draft motion we prepare.
Before we, I would ask that we have a motion to ask staff to draft a favorable recommendation with the discussion that we've heard this evening with regard to waivers. I do want to be sure, though, that our next regular meeting, the deadline for this is June 18th, and will it fall within that time frame?
For our next regularly scheduled meeting, the answer would be no.
Yeah, I
Because
seem
your
to
next
recall an
regularly-
earlier conversation.
Your next regularly scheduled meeting is
June
late in
25th.
June. Correct.
Would the applicant be willing to extend the decision time from the 18th to the 25th?
I'm pretty sure I'm going to be here June 10th, but I don't know about you guys.
That's
11th.
the special meeting. Is that
Right.
something we can add this
So-
to?
What,
Not to put it, I mean, it's not,
No,
doesn't make much of a
I know,
doesn't make a
Mr.
difference, but I'm just,
what we have and we talked about this at the staff level, we have a fairly full agenda on the 10th, and you've already split applications to accommodate workload and planning board load. What I would say to you tonight is I would recommend the extension to the 25th. We
Mr.
do,
Rabbit,
we do.
my clients, we, no objection.
But what I will
Thank
say
you.
is if we have the ability to move it up, it is possible it would appear on your January 10th agenda, because we do have a few things that could drop off of that agenda. So,
And that's the 11th, not the 10th. I believe.
11.
Put it in your calendar.
Both nights then. I'm just kidding.
Thank you, Mr. Callahan.
Thanks. Would someone like to make the motion?
Maria, may I just make one more comment?
Certainly.
Could we get some wording in at the next level that the architectural detailing needs to be consistent with the, I don't know how you want to word it, historically appropriate detailing on the scale and detail on the building?
If the planning board feels that's important, we can roll that in with the aspect to support waiver requests for good planning.
Thank you.
Great suggestion. Is everyone okay with that? So would someone like to make the motion?
I'll make that motion.
Motion from Joe to, for staff to develop a draft motion for approval with the considerations and criteria discussed this evening. Is there a second? Second from Robin. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Motion carries. Thank you.
And just for the record, we do have no objection to the extension. I don't know if that was on the record.
Yes, we got that. Thank you. Our next agenda item is a public hearing, Major Land Development Combined Conceptual Master and Preliminary Plan with Unified Development Plan Review, McCrory proposed 5-lot unit residential building and associated site improvements. Is there anyone representing the applicant?
Hello again, Chair Mack, members of the board. Good to see you. James Callahan here on behalf of Glenn and Gretel McCrory, who are both here tonight behind me. Also have Karen Beck of Principe Engineering, as well as Tom Principe of Principe Engineering. As you know, we're here for a combined conceptual master plan and preliminary plan hearing for 507 and 509 High Street, which is about a mile or 3/4 of a mile north of here. We've been before you in multiple stages of this project, but hopefully we're here to move forward in some respect tonight. Currently, there's a 3-unit building on site which directly abuts High Street. It's a blue shingled structure which has seen better days if you've driven by there recently. The lot we're discussing in the blue building are right next to Flat's Restaurant. Glenn and Gretel purchased the property in early 2019. There were some prior approvals that expired, but that's long gone at this point. The total lot measures 15,678 square feet. By that calculation, as noted in your staff report, this yield plan could amount to about 11 units with 3 affordable. Glenn and Gretel are not looking to max out the property in terms of units. They are proposing to rehabilitate the blue building with those 3 units and add a new building with 5 units to the rear of the current structure. Of the 8 units, 2 will be affordable pursuant to section 502.6, and we believe we need 2 waivers for the rear yard transition setback, which we just discussed in the prior application, as well as paving for the gravel surface under section 703. We also need a variance, which you're lucky enough to hear based on the unified review, as if you don't have enough to do in your jobs here tonight. But I think that overall this project will benefit the town in that it provides more housing in a walkable downtown area. We've also provided elevations and photographs of the current site, along with proposed renderings of the site after construction. At this point, I'd ask Karen Beck and Tom Principe to come up and discuss some engineering aspects and answer any questions.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Karen Beck. I'm a registered landscape architect with Principe Company, and I've been the project manager for this particular project. As discussed, this project has been around for a while. It was previously through the town process, all the way through the preliminary review. And as a result of reaching that level with the town, the project was also submitted to the Department of Environmental Management Freshwater Wetlands section. It was approved twice. The first permit expired, and the second permit was submitted after that expiration. And basically what you see in front of you this evening is pretty much exactly what was approved through that DEM preliminary determination process. The same number of existing units, the same number of proposed units, the same size of building, same number of parking spaces to a certain extent, grading slightly different. The 100-year floodplain was calculated as part of that because this project does have predominantly 100-year floodplain across the entirety of the site. As you can see, that dark line on the left-hand side of the screen. So we paid attention to the fact that any fill should be compensated for in order to make sure there weren't any downstream flooding issues. In addition, the stormwater was submitted and approved by DEM. What you don't see in this particular plan, I don't know who can switch it. Jay, can you do that? There. So what you can see is in the kind of the middle of the screen, there is some grading, And what that is a bioretention area. So that bioretention area was designed per the 2015 stormwater regulations, which requires that the water quality volume and the recharge volume be taken in account into this particular type of bioretention basin. So it does water quality purposes and water quantity purposes. And this basin is exactly the same as what was submitted previously to DEM and approved by them. There were some minor changes that we made to the grading, mostly because of the fact that they had proposed a retaining wall, which quite frankly didn't make a lot of sense. They weren't actually changing enough grade to make a retaining wall worthwhile. So we removed that, but then made sure, again, we were paying attention to the cut and fill for the floodplain compensation. This has got public water, it's got public sewer. The building is designed so that the first floor is a garage with no living space on it, with flood vents, so that's all per the flood regulations as well. The landscape design, if we can switch to that sheet too, Jay? There we go. Is using predominantly native species, especially along the edge of the stream and along the edge of the bioretention area. So river birches and red cedar. There's a couple of other species right in front of the building, which right now doesn't have much landscaping associated with it. There is an existing white fence, screen fence that runs between the existing building and parking area and the Flats restaurant, which is next door. Our proposal is to continue that fence along the western property line. Previously, that had been shown to have some evergreen trees, but we are suggesting to not continue with using those and using a fence along the back of the property on the western property line in order to allow for a greater amount of snow storage. And it will also better screen headlights from the wetland that's behind there. In conversations with Jamie Rabbit and Mark Conboy, we were modifying the screen fencing along the western property line to raise it a little bit to make sure that critters can go underneath it. And then we were proposing to have a split rail fence, and that was partially from the previous pre-application meeting that we had with you, where we were showing boulders because that was what was on the DEM plan. And it was recommended that we do something a little bit more aesthetically pleasing, so we're switching it to a split rail fence. We did meet with Mark Conboy and Jamie Rabbit last week. They had concerns. We received a number of comments from Mark Conboy, which was very helpful. And I think, quite frankly, the biggest concern from Mark's standpoint, and certainly he can correct me if I'm wrong, but it had to do with the drainage and the floodplain, and also the fact that he was concerned that the previous DEM permit may have missed some aspects of the drainage and the floodplain review, so he really felt it was important that it be resubmitted to DEM to get a modification to that permit. It was our opinion, quite frankly, that we didn't need to do that, but in order to satisfy Mr. Conboy's concerns, we have resubmitted to DEM in order to get their review over the present configuration of the site. I believe Jamie's concerns were associated with turning radii. We did provide a revised turning radii plan. We didn't have one originally. Isn't typical to provide one, but we did provide one for pre-app, and then there were still concerns, so we modified that. To be honest, you can start with AASHTO and ITE and use turning radii, but those turning radii are not geared towards what basically is a private driveway. There are only 8 vehicles that are going to be in this area, and 5 of those vehicles park in garages. So there are 3, 4, 5 cars that are going to be parking in this area. And we have over 40 years of experience designing parking lots that have been installed and driven in them, and even to the extent of, with all the concern that there was with the turning radii on this project, we've been out in parking lots with our pickup truck that's bigger than most of the cars that are in this parking lot, and made sure that we can make the 3-point turns. We do know that this works. However, in an abundance of caution, we had also provided Jamie with an alternative plan, which rather than having the parallel parking spaces, which appeared to be his major concern, we were showing 90-degree parking spaces. And keep in mind that the aisle width in all of these areas is in excess of 24 feet. So that is basically a roadway width that gives you plenty of turning radii for any of these types of parking spaces and movements. So we have this that we know works. We have alternative B with the 9-degree, if that really makes everybody feel so much more comfortable. We even have a third option if it really is necessary. But again, it's our professional opinion, and I've been doing this again for 40 years, and Tom Principe is here, registered professional engineer, if you have questions as far as that's concerned. But I would like to assure you, and I will reiterate, that my son lives here, and I would not design something that is going to be unsafe for my son to be dealing with. So just put that somewhere too, to keep that in mind. But this is a good project. We are very confident in terms of what it's showing, the aesthetics to it. The architecture is very nice as well. We do already have a DEM permit. The fire chief has said, fire marshal's comfortable with this. I think getting the new DEM permit's going to resolve things as far as those concerns are. And I guess I would just reiterate again that we are very confident that the turning radii on this project works. So if you've got any questions for me or for Tom Principe, who's the professional engineer who stamps and signs these plans, we would be happy to answer them.
Thank you. Joe?
Just questions relative to the drainage, both at the last meeting and at the TRC meeting. There was considerable concern relative to drainage, and there was some concern expressed by the town engineer relative to the previous submission and whether it accurately reflected the conditions on the site. You mentioned that you made a resubmission to DEM. Can you tell us a little more about what that resubmission is and exactly what the differences were? Were there any changes to the curve number or concentration time or best management practices or mitigation? What were the changes that were actually made?
No, again, we didn't believe that we needed to submit to DEM because basically, as far as we were concerned, we were matching what had previously been approved. Mr. Comboy's concerns had to do with things like the time of concentration, and we provided additional plans to him to get him to see. The fact was that the previous engineer submitted a time of concentration that, quite frankly, we wouldn't necessarily have chosen. We would have gone with 6 minutes for a time of concentration, and what was being shown was a 1.7. But that was what was submitted to DEM and approved by DEM, so we kept that same time of concentration. As far as the amount of existing gravel area, which was another concern of Mr. Comboy's, what I let him know, and quite frankly, if you look at your own town aerial mapping underneath your assessor's maps, you can see that this area, since prior to 2014, was basically one big parking lot. It's always been a gravel area. It's been compacted and parked on for years and years and years. And what is currently out there today, which is what Mr. Conboy went out and looked at, you can see a grass area. But that grass area is just, I can't think of a really good phrase to use, but it's just a little bit of loam and seed over the top of that existing gravel parking lot. So out of the concern for Mr. Conboy, we revised our drainage calculations for him so that he can see that, quite frankly, it doesn't make any huge difference in the numbers if we increase the time of concentration under pre-development conditions, if we change the amount of gravel parking lot under pre-development conditions. It did not significantly change the numbers. But as far as DEM is concerned, we gave them what they previously approved. And we're waiting for them to come back and say that They approved it last time, and they're going to approve it this time.
So I'm just, and I'm sorry, I might be a little confused. Are you saying that your submission was the exact same submission as previous, or are you saying that this submission made minor changes, but they didn't have any significant effect?
The previous submission to DEM was not by Principi Engineering. It was by Gary Lamont.
I recall
The
that.
current submission that we made has our existing conditions, our drainage analysis, our engineering
And
suppositions.
it is on all those things identical to the previous submission, DEM, the curve number, the time of concentration, the mitigation, the best management practices, are they all identical to what was previous? Or are there any changes with this most recent submission?
It's 90% identical.
Okay, 90%. Can you tell us what the 10% differences are?
The 10% difference is that the previous engineer did not break out under post-development conditions the area that actually drained to the bioretention area. He just considered the entire site as one big post-development area. We didn't feel that that was accurate because of the fact that not all of the flow across the property actually drains into the bioretention area. So it gave you a false sense of security in terms of what it was treating. So we broke the area that does drain to the bioretention area as a separate, smaller watershed within the entirety of the post-development. That one small change is basically the difference.
And how did that change the pre or the post-development versus the pre-development in your submission versus the submission that was previously made?
We reduced the flows to the wetland.
So your most recent submission reduces the flow for a post-development condition as compared to the original application?
That is correct.
Okay. On your, the one that was, when do you expect approval or feedback from DEM?
It's about a 4 to 6 week process, approximately. We made the submission last week.
So you expect to have it back in the next month and a half or so?
Approximately, yes.
Okay. Did DEM come out and view the site, or was their approval, the previous approval, as well as this approval that you expect, based solely on the information that was provided to them?
The review engineer for DEM that provided the review for the previous submission is Nicholas Pisani. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He used to be at CRMC. He's been at DEM for years and years. He's one of the few engineers at DEM who's pretty darn consistent about going out to do site visits. When I found out from Mr. Conboy that he was concerned about the fact that it had not been reviewed adequately by DEM, I called Nick Pisani and said, there is a concern by the town engineer in South Kingstown. Here's the differences, what he's concerned about, and I want to make sure that you're aware of these concerns, because it's not like we put those into our submission package. So I did make him very aware of where the concerns were as far as that was concerned. Nick will also be the review engineer for this current submission because he was the one for the previous submission. I have no concerns that, he did not do his due diligence as far as this project is concerned.
But my question was, did he or did he not go out to, either he or anyone else at DEM on the approval chain, go out to the site to review the conditions? When I sat in on the TRC meeting and when I sat in on the last meeting, I don't believe that the town engineer had any concern relative to whether the approval was correct or not, given the information that was submitted. I was under the impression that the concern was that the information submitted may not have reflected the actual site conditions. So there's a difference. If the review is only done by the information that's submitted, they could very well come to the right conclusion if that submission is accurate. If the review does not perform a site visit and the information is not accurate, and then it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, for DEM to make the proper decision. I'm trying to get at, and the concern was expressed, was not whether DEM did a good job or whether they're the authority or any of that. I think that is accepted. The concern was whether the existing site conditions matched the information that was on the application. That's why I'm trying to get at whether DEM actually saw the existing site conditions.
I did not ask him specifically if he made a site visit, but again, I made him very aware that Mr. Conboy is concerned that the existing conditions are not what was submitted to them previously. So he is aware of that fact.
All right, so with that said, I'm going to turn to the town engineer and ask the question, expressed concerns before. Are you now comfortable that the information that's being submitted in this latest accurately reflects the conditions on the site?
Partially, yes. I do agree with some of what you said there, that the analysis that you gave me in regard to the curve numbers didn't change the drainage characteristics that much, but what I was concerned with was a couple of other issues that needed to be resolved. First of all, DEM reviewed this as a site-specific plan, that any changes that are being made have to be approved by them. One of the biggest changes that I saw right away was looking at the watershed map. Was the original engineer's map showed this being analyzed as one watershed. So that's one watershed going to this bioretention area. Then this second plan is modeled differently. It's modeled with a watershed a smaller watershed going to the bioretention area, and another discharge point being modeled off to on this sheet before you on the screen, on the left-hand side on the dotted line, going to the wetland to the north. So that was not shown, as far as I could tell, in the DEM permit, a change of a drainage pattern. So I needed to get that verified for one thing. Another thing that I was concerned with didn't even have to do with DEM, which is our stormwater ordinance, which restricts having this a BMP constructed within a floodplain. So I'm not sure how that gets resolved, because the way that this is designed, it will be flooded during a 100-year storm, and our ordinance restricts that as being not allowed. So I'm stuck up against that one on our ordinance, trying to follow what the ordinance allows.
Well, to backtrack, this watershed map that you see in front of you has been submitted to DEM. So they are reviewing it this way. So the difference in the watershed, although we're going to have to agree to disagree, I still think if you had reviewed the previous engineer's watershed map, you would see that he actually did have water draining to the stream, although he didn't have it accurately delineated on his map. But we corrected it, and we have submitted to DEM, and this is what they are reviewing. As far as the basin being within the 100-year floodplain, yes, this basically the entirety of this site is within the 100-year floodplain. So the bioretention basin does not function during a 100-year flood event. Quite frankly, the town's roadway system, catch basins, there's quite a number of things don't function in a 100-year flood event in this particular area. But as far as the regulation is concerned, that's a legal issue that I believe Mr. Callaghan has spoken with the town solicitor regarding that. And so if you want to.
Go ahead.
Just for some clarity or context, I think I don't know if you've seen this part of the statute, but section 20-66, I believe, 26.8, technical standards, part 2, does state disallowed stormwater best management practices. It says, e.g., for example, I think that's what it means, the placement of structural BMPs and other stormwater structures within a floodplain shall be avoided. But then it says, if there is no alternative, which there is none here, the applicant must show what effects, if any, the tailwaters created by the floodplain will have on the outflow and the effective storage capacity of the detention facility. So it's partly a legal question, but also a reality question. In the 100-year flood, we know what happens. I mean, we have an idea, I think. And it's just can't be avoided. So I think that that's not a reason that this project can't be approved, and I don't think Mr. Squires necessarily disagrees.
Thank you.
So just, Madam Chair, just before legal speaks, just with regards to staff's
Yes, and I have some questions
review of
for
this from the
DPS as well.
engineering perspective. The ordinance does state that it is supposed to be avoided. And it does state that if there is no alternative available. There is an alternative available. You are proposing 5 units. There are alternatives available to proposing 5 units. What the ordinance goes on to say that if you are proposing to put infrastructure within the floodplain, there's further analysis that is needed. So it's layered. So the alternative would be to not develop the property and leave it in the manner it is, which means you don't need to comply with the ordinance. But when you are proposing to have a development which affects the placement of a BMP, there is always an alternative to the placement of that BMP, because the BMP's placement is a result of the quality, quantity, size, and placement of your development. So the alternative to that is always to make it smaller, move it, or not do it. So there is always an alternative available. The way out in the ordinance is if you still propose to move forward, alternatively, you have to do further analysis of what are the effects of the stream channel and the water courses and water floodplain associated with that stream channel. We do not have that analysis yet, and I don't know if the applicant's prepared to do that, but, you know, again, it's a layered effect within the ordinance, and I have discussed that with council.
Another question. I got a question, I guess it's for Jay. What's the requirements for, the town's requirements as far as completeness of the application, getting approval from DEM, or just applying to DEM prior to this coming in front of the planning board?
Well, they're required to have all their permits in hand at this stage of review. As far as the discrepancy that's occurred, that's been discovered as the project's been reviewed, it's at the purview of the planning board as to what the solution to that might be. Obviously, a decision on this application that's before you right now would carry. So in my eyes, from a professional standpoint, it would make sense that all of the permitting gets worked out and that there's assurance that it complies with not only the state regulations, but local regulations in some form or fashion.
Madam Chair, so just to quickly touch on that issue of Section 20-68-2, and that's the disallowed stormwater management practices. I got it. So I'd add one qualifier to what Jamie stated, is that it is a disallowed practice to place stormwater structures within the floodplain. I think it does allow for that if there's no alternative. I think you need to read into that no reasonable alternative, because, you know, there's always an alternative. You could say, well, just don't develop anything on that parcel. So to make the section make sense, you have to interpret it as, is it a reasonable alternative? And I agree that that requires you to balance two things. One is, on the one hand, what else can they do? And on the other hand, what the ordinance specifies is what's the effect on the tailwaters created in the floodplain. So on the one hand, if they can show the effect on the tailwaters are minimal, maybe you give them a little bit more leeway on the other end as what's reasonable. But if what they can do requires a big effect on the tailwaters, that to me, that's the balance that you have to look at.
Thank you, Peter. And Joe's questions were very technical and very well done. I would like to hear a little bit more from Mark. Thank you for this very thorough memo that you've given us. Not all planning board members are civil engineers, so we may not understand some of the details. So it would be very helpful for us if you could go over some of these things and perhaps add your suggestions where there could be an improvement or a better degree of compliance.
Well, my recommendation to be more in compliance with that ordinance would be to have that spillway from the bioretention area above the floodplain area so that the tailwater would not be entering back into the bioretention area and rendering it useless underwater, inundated. So that would be a design feature that they would have to re-engineer and most likely submit it back to DEM for approval as well.
And as everyone is aware, stormwater is an issue that this board takes very seriously. When we approve something, if anywhere down the road something is amiss or there's a problem, then the new residents come back to the town, and we need to be sure that we are as thorough as possible, as well as the fact that we understand that these 100-year storms are occurring with much greater frequency. I think the most recent is 10 years ago, and we just had the 6 inches of rain a couple of weeks ago. So we want to ensure that this be handled well. Can you also tell us, Mark and or Jamie, to what degree of resubmission to DEM will occur on this? Will it just be certain specifics relative to stormwater or some of the other issues that have been raised?
Like, to try and answer that, I think the applicant needs to clarify what revisions are need to be made to comply with local regulations. So if it's an adjustment to parking which affects the expansion of a curb edge or expands the area of potential surface treatment, that needs to be resolved. If, to Mr. Conboy's point, it's a change to the bioretention or an outflow associated with that, that should be potentially evaluated at the local level and then resubmitted to the state. I think, it's a kind of the old adage of chicken and the egg, what comes first? You go to DEM, get an approval, then you have to comply with the local level and something changes and then you're back before DEM again. So I think there's a coordinated effort that needs to occur here and communication between town staff, DEM, and the applicant to achieve an ultimate goal of the applicant's wishes that this gets approved as a 5-unit development with parking for 8 vehicles. I don't have a definitive answer of exactly which way or path the applicant wants to choose to go. But again, we had, to Karen Beck's point, we did meet last week. We got revised plans Friday, and we did our best to try and get some comments and communicate with them earlier today about what some of the concerns were. To Mr. Parker's point, and to follow up on Mr. Murphy's point, with regards to incompleteness, when they submitted their application, they did submit what they thought were valid approvals from DEM. So to Mr. Murphy's point, that box was checked. What came into question is that approval still valid, given the modifications that have been made to the site between initial approvals and revisions made to the plan. So, some things still need to be coordinated and worked out, both at the local and state level, and as well as the development layout. Again, it would be my recommendation that the public hearing not be closed and be continued, which will allow the applicant to supplement the record and continue to work on a number of items. Just one aspect, I won't go through my resume or my background, but I've been a planner for a long time. I've worked extensively with 3 departments of transportation. I've been trained by the Federal Highway Administration and extensively by Connecticut Department of Transportation. I rely on standards. Standards are there for a reason. Typical standards also give you modifications to those standards, but in my experience, a 10-foot turning radius has never been used in anything I've ever reviewed for my entire career. So for a person who says I have credentials as a landscape architect and a designer to modify an accepted turning radius by over 4 feet, I disagree with. I wouldn't do that professionally. I am aware of a subcompact turning radius at 11.5, but not at 10. At last month's hearing, I asked about the 10-foot turning radius. It was alleged that it was used as a standard from a entity that established a standard. I'm concerned tonight and with as well as a previous meeting a week ago where we found out that that standard, in fact, wasn't a recognized standard by any known respectable entity such as IT or AASHTO or Federal Highways or even a state DOT, but it was a personal opinion of a professional. I would still like to see the appropriate turning radiuses because as staff, both Mark Comby and I will put the appropriate turning templates on and try and find a solution here. We're not just here to say no, we're here to seek solutions. And again, I don't know if the solution affects the unit count, affects the limit of disturbance previously approved with DEM, but there are potential solutions out here using a more appropriate standard.
So, Jamie, it's okay if I ask Jamie a question? Jamie, I think it's obvious that you and your staff have reviewed this application and this project pretty significantly. Have you formed any opinion, or do you believe that there's a possibility that there's a option of developing those additional 5 units on that lot if they perhaps look at maybe a different footprint, a different layout, a different number of stories? I mean, the town needs housing. I think overall it's a good project, but there's these concerns that we need to, I think, mitigate in order to go forward.
Yeah, I think, Mr. Murphy, to try and answer your question tonight, considerable amount of effort has gone in on the design team hired by the applicant to revive a previously approved plan. Karen Beck mentioned tonight that they had a 90-degree parking alternative that was left with me a week ago. We haven't had adequate time to fully vet that or have the conversation with the applicant's representative of that's the direction they want to go if we feel that works. I want to say you have smart, savvy individuals involved in the layout here. I think there is a potential solution here. It may push against DEM's original permit, but there are potential solutions. This is a tight site. You're pushing up against a brook, you're pushing up against a wetland to the east. From my perspective, if you're 10 feet away and end up 8 feet away, in the big picture of things of trying to supply housing and support infill, I would rather be safer and push up against a resource potentially, if that's okay with the state. It may require additional permitting or a delay in that permitting, but I haven't come to the conclusion that 5 units don't fit here yet, Joe. I think there may be options, but those options need to be explored.
Do you believe that those options could possibly also address the concerns relative to the retention area?
I think the difficulty there is if we could change elevations, we could have different effects, but you can't change elevations in a floodplain without additional storage, and because the site's so small, you don't have those opportunities to regrade the site. So I think you're still gonna run up into those issues. But again, the analysis can be done so that you know what the implications are. Right now, we don't know what the implications are.
Thank you.
It appears that there are quite a few very technical issues with regard to this project, and the impression that I certainly have been given from memos that we've received in tonight's conversation is that more work needs to be done. There needs to be the submission to DEM. A site visit from DEM would probably be preferable. The turning movements, all of these things need to be discussed and hopefully resolved before this board can really make an informed decision. The deadline that we have is August 12th, so that gives us some time, but it seems to me that more work needs to be done here.
Yeah.
And
again, I would like to just reinforce the point. We've had good conversations with the applicant's representatives. They've been robust, in some aspects, we've agreed to disagree. But the applicant's representatives haven't, drawn a line in the sand and said, we're just not going to do anything anymore. We're not willing to discuss it. This is our layout, take it or leave it. Those discussions are ongoing. Karen and I spoke, I want to say, losing track of days this week, on Wednesday, and followed up with an email this morning. So again, I think I'm encouraged by the conversations and their willingness to supply additional information. I don't think we're at the point, and perhaps, Ms. Beck can weigh in, that we're at the point where we're just agreeing to disagree. I think there's, to your point, Madam Chair, there's some work to be done and some coordination to continue.
are there questions or comments from board members at this time? Would someone like to make a motion to continue this hearing to our June 25th meeting? We have a motion from Joe. Do we have a second?
I'll second that.
Second from Susan. Any further discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor say aye. Oh,
If that's not enough time for...
hang on a second.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, we're just, all three of us are looking at time clock for a moment.
If we don't have DM back by then, we probably ask for a continuance in advance. Just
We're good to the, a good week and a half into August.
Okay.
And again, I would say, if some of these matters in permitting aren't resolved, there's a potential where the applicant just asks you to continue in August until some of these things are worked out.
Sure.
So,
That sounds reasonable. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next agenda item is Development Plan Review Advisory to Zoning Sanchez DPR, proposed change of use to residential occupancy for more than 3 unrelated people. Is there anyone representing the applicant?
Good evening, everyone. I'm Felipe Sanchez, and I'd like to make a motion to approve the petition of my house at 62 Weather Vane Road, Wakefield. This is for a special use permit to allow 5 unrelated individuals within the existing family dwelling. Specifically, 4 tenants and I as the owner. This is a building that has 5 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms. I'm applying for this special use because of the awareness of the regulations. There have been no concerns by the neighbors on the property in terms of use and the number families except for the parking, which is also being addressed in this special use application. The main concern during the TRC meeting was the fire code compliance and the parking installation specification. For the fire code, they added active signs and evacuation plans for each bedroom. There's also an existing interconnected fire alarms in the house. After inspection, the fire code compliance certificate has been given by the town fire department, and I also added the parking installation specification of the gravel in addition to the plans that I provided in April 2024, depicting the parking spaces and its dimension. These proposed parking lot has 48 feet in width and 42 feet in length, with 24 feet of backup. I've been personally wanting to add a parking lot in the back of my house because the front parking is too steep for me, and backyard is the best location for a flat parking area. Any questions?
I will just say on the parking, turning templates according to AASHTO and ITE were used on the layout of that parking lot.
Questions, comments from board members?
What's the current occupancy?
There's 4 people right now.
And is the occupancy going to be seasonal? Are you looking at students?
It's gonna be students or family, but mainly students, long-term, yearly specifically.
School year?
Yeah, school year.
And then during the summer?
That's still that's still in decision for me to decide, but right now I'm only doing a yearly lease for the moment.
And how far are we from campus?
It's about 8 minutes, 8 to 10 minutes, maybe more, depending on the traffic.
Thank you.
Question for you or perhaps staff. There are some comments from TRC that discuss stormwater management with the new parking areas and potential for additional soil erosion control. Has that been addressed or modified to your satisfaction? Yes.
If I may, the applicant has provided a detail of that parking area, showing it as gravel underneath with 3 inches of angular stone and some sort of a geogrid on top of that as well. So yes, it does comply.
Susan?
Hey, welcome. So it looks like you've had the house since 2021.
Yeah.
Have you been renting it in this fashion since you got the house?
I started in 2022 because I did renovate it first for a couple of months, but I did start renting it early 2022.
Okay. So the owners previous to you, were they also renting to students, or, you know, was there a family living in that home, or was it also a rental?
It was a family. It was also a rental. From what I've known because I talked to the previous owner.
Yep.
And they were renting it to a family before.
Okay. So if it's been an ongoing rental, do we know if there's been any conversations with the police, any problems, any issues with that property in the past? I looked at the property on Zillow, and it looked like it was a rental, like a student, it looks like a student rental before Mr. Sanchez purchased the property. But I wonder if there's been a history of any problems with that property.
With regards to that question, Ms. Askerock, we're not aware of any
Okay.
that were reported to us as part of this application process. We had the fire marshal involved in TRC review, as well as the building official, and nothing was brought up with regards to complaints.
Okay. And you would absolutely plan to stay on site, living
Yeah.
in that house?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions, Joe?
When you rent out, you mentioned that you have, I'm moving. Oh, sorry. Okay, that's okay. You mentioned that it's for 5 people, 4 tenants and yourself. When you rent out to the 4 tenants, you rent out to them individually with a lease per tenant, or are you renting out to a group of 4 with 1 lease?
Initially, for the first year, I did it individually. For the next year, I did it with a 1 lease.
Okay. And then if you potentially rent it out in the summer as a short-term rental, it would also be your intention to do it with 1 lease?
Yeah, if I decide to rent it in the summer.
Okay. So all the questions, I guess, maybe goes to Peter or Jamie. We recently had another project that came before us. It was actually a little bigger than this, and they were asking for slightly more people. There was questions and concerns from the board at the time on when do we cross over from a single-family dwelling with multi-people to that point where we get into either a commercial where it's bed and breakfast, or et cetera. We had, in that particular case, we put conditions of approval, such as there only be 1 lease, not individual leases, that they rent it to a group, not individual, and that there not be locks on the separate doors. And there might have been a couple other conditions of approval. Is there any reason why we would not be consistent
We have
and
those
perhaps
in-
look at those same conditions of approval?
We have those in your draft
They're in
motion.
there? Okay.
Yes. 1 lease, no locks on individual doors, limitations on total occupancy, we'll call leasees and guests. So that is all covered. And again, the base we used was your prior decision associated with the Oliver Perry property.
Okay, thank you.
So I have another question. Because the owner is living on the property and he's living in that house, to me, it maybe feels a little different that if he were to find a couple of roommates, they aren't necessarily a friend group. I would want to see I would want to see one cohesive group as a rental in a not owner occupied building. But because he's living there, I feel like maybe he might want the ability to swap out different people, because he's on site, he's not going to live with people he doesn't want to live with, but is there maybe more flexibility because it is owner occupied and he's basically getting a couple of roommates to help him pay his mortgage, as opposed to living off site?
I think my response to that would be is you're permitting a land use for a property. You're not entering to a contract scenario with an individual who owns the property. So this goes with the property. The property could be sold tomorrow, and that provision may or may not exist. So you don't know if it's owner occupied as time moves forward.
So I hear that and I understand that, but for him now to find a 4-person friend group who all want to stay there for the same duration of time.
He stated this evening that he signs 1 lease for 4 individuals who signed that 1 lease.
Without any ability to sub.
He stated tonight he has 1 lease with 4 individuals signing that 1 lease.
Okay.
And has changed to that model from his prior model of having independent leases. So.
Okay.
Any additional comments or questions? Mr. Sanchez, have you had the opportunity to read the staff comments and the conditions of approval in the draft motion?
Yes, I read it yesterday.
Great. Any other comments from staff?
No, I think we're all set.
If board members are comfortable, we have a draft motion. No. That begins on page 2. And although this isn't a public hearing, if there is anyone in the audience who wishes to comment, feel free to do so.
Can I ask about the abutters? Are the abutting lots single-family homes with families, or are they also rentals? What's
They're single families, the neighbors that the one across and both my neighbors on the left and the right side, they're all single families.
And none of them are here tonight?
No, I don't think so.
Thank you.
Yeah, because I know all of them.
Yes, I did.
I'll make that motion if that's what you're looking for.
Do you want to read the paragraph?
The South Kingstown Planning Board hereby grants advisory development plan approval to the Commodore Manor LLC to...
Reading the wrong one.
The South Kingstown Planning Board hereby grants advisory development plan approval to Sanchez to allow the household occupancy by 5 unrelated individuals within the existing single-family dwelling located on Assessors Plat 48-4, Lot 76, located at 62 Weather Vane Road, as depicted on the site plan entitled Site Plan Philippe Sanchez, located at 62 Weather Vane Road, South Kingstown, Rhode Island, sheets 01, dated 3/12/24, prepared by Dean's Consultants. The approval is based upon the following findings of fact and condition of approval for the zoning board to... findings of fact A through E, conditions of approval 1 through 11.
We have a motion from Joe. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Second from Liz. Any further discussion?
I have one
Susan?
point. So this approval will last for a period of 3 years? And then, Mr. Sanchez, do you realize you'll be back to have a renewal in 3 years, so that if the neighbors complain and there's things going on in the neighborhood, it may affect your renewal of this permit?
Okay.
Okay.
Any further comments? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. Thank you. Generally, the board takes a 5-minute break about 2 hours into our meeting. This may be a good time to do that. Is everyone all right with that? We are continuing to our next agenda item, which is a recommendation to the Town Council, Advisory Zoning Map and Text Amendment, Tide Storm LLC, proposed creation of a new commercial neighborhood, Matunic, zoning district and associated zoning text amendments associated with the lots listed on the agenda.
I think that's on. Good evening, Madam Chair, members of the board. Attorney Matthew Landry on behalf of the applicant or petitioner, Tide Storm LLC. You may recall last month we came before you as this project has progressed, and there were a couple of licensing issues that came up with DBR. And just to recap, we had originally petitioned for this zone change to allow brew pubs and breweries in the Matunic Village under this new sub-district, the CNM zoning district. We still stand by that. We had reduced the number of the parcels down to limiting it to only the commercial properties. We removed the residential properties that we had originally proposed to rezone, again, to limit the impacts and things of that nature. At the last meeting, and prior to the last meeting, staff and I had discussed DBR's involvement in the licensing and how this was being teed up on the town level, and whether or not we might run afoul of licensing issues at a later stage by requiring these to be accessory uses. By nature, brew pubs are generally accessory anyway to a restaurant with alcohol use. But there was a question from DBR as to whether or not you could actually have these called accessory and the way you develop them on the site. And, staff and I kind of went back and forth. I was talking to DBR. So we had a meeting about 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. The applicant and staff had a very productive meeting, and I thank staff for its time and its diligence in providing that meeting. What came out of that was basically to kind of reformat the ordinance, and instead of doing these uses as accessory, make them uses allowed by special use permit. And that's the general consensus, and staff did a very thorough report and the rationale behind that. But there are checks and balances built into the special use permit process that controls the design, the aesthetics, the size, the scaling, all the issues that we've been talking about. And in essence, the brew pub operation requires a restaurant. You have to have a restaurant in order to get licensed for it, and it is accessory generally to a restaurant with alcohol use, and those uses are already permitted in this district. The sub-district that we're creating was done purposefully to avoid any impacts to other areas of town. As I'm sure you could see in staff's recommendation or their memo, the town doesn't have any definitions for brew pubs or breweries as of now, and they're taking this opportunity, I think, to expand the definitions in town and to clarify that and to have some standards spelled out. So generally, we're in agreement with all of those standards that were outlined. Some were staff, some were recommendations that we had put in our original petition. Those things deal with wastewater discharge, both if it's in an area that requires sewer. It wouldn't be applicable here because we don't have sewer in this area. But there are provisions that are part of this ordinance now that are being recommended, and what we've revised our petition to reflect are very specific standards under the special use permit criteria, which is now specifically required by the state law. So I think we've done a good job to address those things. Mr. Gorman in zoning was involved in this dialogue as well. Had some commentary. So I think generally we're in agreement as to the format. There are really one area I think that we still have a little bit of a disagreement, and that's the production capacity. When we began this process, we were at a 10 to 15 barrel system, and I know the technical aspects of the facility haven't been fully discussed because we don't have a formal plan in front of you. We're trying to be able to do this first. We'll come back in front of the town with the facility. We talked about storage containers and things of that nature, but I think it is important to talk about the storage capacity. Staff is recommending a 3-barrel maximum production limit. We had originally petitioned for 10 to 15. Really the minimum amount that my client can make an economically viable operation, even make this possible, is a 7-barrel system. And we've pitched that to staff. Now, we haven't really explored that. I think it would be helpful to have my client come and kind of explain why a 7-barrel system is necessary and why a 3-barrel system actually doesn't make a lot of sense. It's not just an economic issue, but you have to brew twice as much with the smaller systems. So there's actually more byproduct, there's more waste product. There's a very long 2 to 3 to 4 week process that the beer has to stay in the fermenters before it can get packaged. So there's a backlog, and there's a lot of reasons why a 7-barrel system is needed. So with your permission, Madam Chair, I'd like to ask Mr. Finnegan to come up, and I'll ask some very specific questions as to why the 7-barrel capacity is needed. That's, I think, with respect to staff's comments, I think that's the only point that we disagree on. I think generally with the special use permit criteria, the way it's formatted, we're in agreement. The only other point I'll bring up, we had originally petitioned for distilleries, brew pubs, breweries, additional uses to be allowed in this district. We've dropped distilleries and microbreweries from the definitions. We've included brewery and brew pub because those are the two relevant uses that we'd like to be able to do. One of those uses, as you may remember, requires the operation of a restaurant. The other would require an abandonment of the restaurant. That's not the intent at this time, but we've dropped the other uses from the request. So again, if I could ask Mr. Finnegan just a couple of questions to provide some context on why 3 versus 7 is a pretty significant difference, and why we're asking for 7.
Certainly.
Yep, Kevin Finnegan.
Kevin, could you just describe briefly for the board some of the components that are involved in the brewer operation, the tanks and the fermenters, and just generally what those, what that equipment?
The actual equipment is similar, 3 and 7. It's just that in a 3, you got to like make beer twice as much, 3 times as much to move it. And so you usually actually, there's like environmentally, it's like more wastewater. And then on the economy side or economic side, it's when you go to even can the beer, the minimal amount you got to have is like to have a truck come down and can it. They only handle with 7-barrel systems, not 3-barrel systems. And if you wanted to add, we discussed like brake tanks and storing it. So then you actually got to expand your footprint. So a 3-barrel system, to make it efficient, is actually bigger and more space than an actual 7-barrel system. You can kind of keep it all going, you know, economy of scales and product and things like that. You know.
Matt, can I just ask a question? The 3, 5, 7-barrel reference, the barrel reference, each barrel is about 31 gallons, I believe. What is that number limiting or speaking to? Is it speaking to the amount that you can actually brew? I'm not talking about in the fermenter, but the actual brewing process where you're boiling the wort, processing, doing all of that. Is the barrels limited to the brewing component, or is the barrels limited to the brewing component and the fermenter together?
Again, I'm not a brewer, but I'm asking, and but a 3-barrel system, it get like turn into a 6 doesn't mean you get double B. Turn into a 7, it's almost 3 times the amount of being able to have different beers, more opportunity, more experimentation. With a 3-barrel system, it really paints you in a corner, more towards the hobbyist, or maybe having a place where you want to add a few beers to existing beers like Miller Bud and other beers. But if you want to be, to make it all viable economically, and then things like pop up was the big thing to me was environmentally. To run a 3-barrel system, you use twice the amount of water, and I was like, well, why? How come? Because you got to wash it more often. Where in a 1-barrel, a bigger barrel system, you can brew a whole amount of beer, which you need, get it out of there, and then wash it once, So you brew more beer, like 3 times the amount of beer with one process,
Right, but so if we are brewing 3 times the amount of beer, that means you are also storing 3 times the amount of beer. And while that stores, you can brew more. So I'm trying to figure out the scale of the limitation, and that's something that I could not really get a good handle on when I was doing the research on it, as to that 3-barrel limit. Is that just you're limited to a system that can boil 3 barrels at a time, or are you limited to a system that can be a combination of, hey, I'm trying to understand the parameters as to what that applies to.
Pretty much from everyone I've talked to, like the research, or actually the actual brewer, and he's like, you wouldn't want to start a system or any kind of operation less than 7, because it would be more on the hobby side, or in addition to, like, you want to sell 3 of your own kind of beer to an addition to a Bud, a Miller, and stuff like that. So he's kind of like, I'm not a professional brewer, so we're kind of learning as we go. But
You get this information from the brewmaster.
the brewmaster, and he, I was like, hey, I don't particularly, he says you can't go under a 7.
The industry standard for this type of operation.
Industry standard for this type of operation.
In our understanding too, so it has a significant impact from a production standpoint, and also the test kitchen concept is that Kevin, you can speak to this too, he doesn't want to brew just one type of beer. He wants to brew maybe 2, 3 and test other batches. With the 3-barrel system, you're limited to how many batches you can do and how much you can test, because you've only got so many fermenters, so many brake tanks, so many boil tanks. Having a 7-barrel system gives you a bigger ability to do more than one type of beer.
Okay, so based on how you just explained it, Matt, the 3-barrel limitation is the system in its entirety, including the
That's my understanding.
the fermenters and everything else.
Yeah, and Kevin again can testify to this. Can you retrofit a 3-barrel system, after the fact, or is it?
No, you can't do that. 2 reasons. If you need a 4-cylinder and you want to end up at an 8-cylinder like we were talking, I would have to get rid of the 4-cylinder, put a 6 in, then get rid of the 6, put an 8-cylinder in. You can't weld 2 cylinders to that 3-barrel system. So that's financially crazy. Or if you knew as you said, come back, you have your 3-barrel system, you'd have to refit the plumbing, the floors, the drainage, or anything you're doing whatsoever. So where the happy number is to where we think we want to be is that 7-barrel system. And then things pop up, like I'll bring, less water, less this, more efficient. It's like, wow, it's a win-win, for us and you or the town, or especially that area. It's like, it's not like there's a big sewer system, things like that. That was the number 1, number 2 things.
And Kevin, from a production standpoint, the difference between a 3-barrel system and a 7-barrel system impacts what you can do off-site. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
To bottle and package the materials is much more cost prohibitive with the 3-barrel system than a 7-barrel system.
Correct.
Correct. Can you just kind of explain why that is?
I like worst case scenario. If this all doesn't work, a 7-barrel system can sit there, maintain itself, maintain its brewer, maintain the footprint. A 3-barrel system can't do that for like the water, the number of reasons, the extra costs. You can't can it, you know what I mean? Or you have to go off premise and guarantee, I think it's 100 kegs, barrels, not kegs. 100 barrels is the minimum at Pawtucket. That's like a huge jump. So as we talked earlier, you get the brand up, but if it's right at that level where it's not big enough to upscale, but it's small enough where it is, it's self-sustaining forever. It won't fail. It'll be successful. It is what it is. My analogy, I'm more in the restaurant business. You need you can't have a great cook and a great kitchen with 3 tables. Is it 10? Is it, it's like 25 tables minimum. There's a minimum happy number. In the beer business, from what I've been told, and what I do agree with, is the 7-barrel system.
And I think that's where we're at, is that I don't know if there's anyone involved currently that knows the system, that knows exactly what all this is going to look like and what it's going to mean, which is why we started out, why the recommendation was 3 barrels, is crawl before we walk. It's been explained that it was a pilot system and that we wanted to try it out and establish a brand, and I would think that since we're all well, particularly you, since you're new to this and aren't really experienced with it, that would be a welcoming concept, not only for you, but for other opportunities throughout town where this might be utilized. So I think, this is a recommendation to council. There can be more insight put into this and get a little bit of level of comfort of exactly what does it look like. Not necessarily how is it going to fit on your property, but what does a system like this, if a brewer were to use a 3-barrel system versus a 7-barrel system, what does that operation actually look like? If they were brewing all the time, how much beer could be potentially stored, and how does that lay out? I think we're on the same lines in a lot of ways, but I think our inexperience in that kind of gives us this little tug of war where I don't know the answer. My research kind of just, I didn't feel comfortable with how I understood it exactly.
I got 11 businesses, and I don't understand most of them. Believe it, but the reasoning being, I don't understand plumbing, but I got really good plumbers. I don't understand carpentry. I got good lawyers. I can talk to a lawyer. I can talk to a plumber. The Mr. Moss, the people I'm, no partners and type of things. The people I'm involved with, I know where to get the right answer, and I'm very comfortable. 4 months ago, I learned as you did. I'm very happy. I trust them implicitly. Their past experience, what they've done this, that 7-barrel system, the space, the magic number. They see my property, they see it, it fits, it's perfect. You're gonna see, like if a chef came up to me, which you see a lot of restaurants fail, great food, great kitchen. You go to the front of the house, there's only 3 tables or 10 tables. The economy of scale doesn't work. So that number, I relate that widget to food, rock and roll, surfboards, all the other businesses that I run, and that's the number. I don't want to overdo it, but worstly, I don't want to underdo it. And if I do it right in that magic place, if the upscale, the brand doesn't pop, like that's the main thing, you got a nice, cool little place that can be self-sustained, keep the jobs, keep it going, stuff like that, where the 3-barrel system cannot do that.
So, Madam Chair, just in a little bit of a summary, we may not be able to resolve 3, 5. I have a version with a 5-barrel system, which is 155 gallons per batch, but you may not be able to resolve that. What Jay's primary focus on is, what are the implications of a 3-barrel system? What are the implications of a 5-barrel system? Not necessarily on the business model, but on footprint, waste product, water usage, all those ancillary things. And I think may need to continue the discussion on that. But the primary focus of all the hard work that Jay has done is really the structure of the zone change and the structure of the potential ordinance change. Mr. Landry mentioned that they started out with distilleries and other things and farm distilleries, and that has been pared down in a very strategic manner to allow Mr. Finnegan to proceed, but also open up the venue. And to Mr. Parker's thoughtfulness, we equated it to the fact of a restaurant. If a restaurant is allowed to sell alcohol within the confines of that restaurant, other than the manufacturing aspect, there's not a big difference between a restaurant selling beer than a restaurant selling alcohol. The difference being the manufacturing process that comes onto the site. So Jay's whole structure, which I know he wants to get into, is how staff was proposing to make changes to the original application. Again, you may not be comfortable whether it's a 3 or a 7-barrel. I know Mr. Finnegan and Mr. Landry had weighed in on the financial side, and not necessarily the financial side, but the structural and implementation of a brewery at a 3-barrel versus a 7. And again, you were upwards of 15 before, so somewhere 7 is in the middle of that. But I don't want to lose sight of the structure of the regulation and to make sure you as a planning board are comfortable with that. And then the implications on where this could land and where all the commercial neighborhood zones are in town. And Jay has methodically gone through that over the past few weeks.
So yeah, that, I have a couple of basic questions related to that. So this is a creation of a new zone plus a new definition in the zoning use table. How would the potential of a 7-barrel system relate to brew pubs in other zoning districts?
So then I think Jay can walk through what the implications of brew pubs are on the districts.
And then also, when you get into specific criteria, is it an obvious statement that effluent management would differ for a larger system? Sort of obvious question, I guess.
Yeah, so the effluent component, on a property that's not sewered, it's subject to the septic, the OWTS. For a property that's sewered, there are some limitations or some concerns through DPS in our sewer system regarding BOD, I believe. I was not able to get any suggestions or anything in regards to that into the ordinance and into the suggested standards for the special use permit. But yes, the concern from DPS regarding BOD, which is
Biological
oxygen demand, right, biological oxygen demand, is scalable. So the concerns with 100 gallons of effluent to 100,000 gallons of effluent is exponentially more concerning. It's whether or not there are some engineering things that need to get done, and there's some discussions that have to happen with DPS, I believe, because the director has reached out to our existing breweries in town and tried to get to a point where it's workable, because they put a great deal of strain on our systems. I can't speak to the BOD or to anything more than that. And as you know, as we talk and I'm considering what the applicant is saying about a larger system, it comes to my mind that there needs to be additional standard in there for the special use permit that these systems need to be laid out. They need to be shown that the sites they're located in can be accommodated, and that the storage of any product, be it in a fermenter or in a can or in a keg, can be accommodated at the site as well, and it's not just in hallways and closets and everywhere else because there's nowhere to put it. I do think that, but that is, again, a scalable component depending on the size of the property, size of the building, size of the operation. We can't regulate that to the T. We just have to say that they'd have to come in one by one and be reviewed against some standard that allows the town to be comfortable with what's being proposed.
So the capacity would be variable dependent on specific criteria and the site itself?
Well, I think the capacity, they would need to show that the site can handle the capacity.
Yep.
And the capacity being all things related to the production of it, whether it's actual beer being brewed or beer in a can sitting in a cardboard box.
So again, it's the operation and all necessary infrastructure.
And Maria, I don't know if you want me to elaborate on the expansion of the town into the other zones and everything now, or if we want to,
I think you probably should, because we want to be clear that this is not a zone change for a specific applicant, but it's townwide, therefore it's not considered spot zoning, so to speak.
Can I ask a question before you do? I was not clear from this, the difference in the definition between brewery and brew pub. And it looks like brew pub has foods, restaurant service on the premises. And saloon is the old definition for what's now brewery.
No.
Because saloon had no food.
So,
and brewery has no food. But then it said on the premises, and unless it's on the same site as one of the existing restaurants, then it couldn't be a brew pub because that's supposed to be a restaurant. So I got very confused by the definitions of those terms. So if you could explain brewery versus brew pub, because then on the use table on here, it has brewery not allowed in any commercial zone on here. Yeah.
So
thank you.
So a brew pub is, a brew pub needs to sell food. They need to sell food. Saloons were defined as drinking establishments without food service. So a bar, essentially, with no food at all. That type of use is not allowed, and although it's in our use code, they don't authorize that type of license in this town. So saloons would never come to fruition. A brewery requires a manufacturer's license to manufacture, and they don't need to provide, so they're a manufacturer, and then they also can incorporate a tap room where they can sell their own product. They don't need to provide food to do that, but they can only sell their own product. They can't sell anyone else's. A brew pub, by definition, provides food, brews their own beer, serves their own beer, and can serve other manufacturers' beers. Breweries can't do that. So I think the brewery component of it that we get confused about regarding serving food is really just that tap room extension of the brewery where, we have a big production facility, but we want people to come in and hang out and try our beers and make it a spot. And it's got a little different, it's a little different than a brew pub, a lot different than a brew pub. And if I was wrong on that, please correct me. That's how I understood
that was a good analysis. I mean, the biggest distinction, and we've explored this further with DVR, is that you're literally not allowed to have food in a brewery operation because it's purely manufacturing with a tap room. A brew pub, by definition, is really the only exception to that where you actually can have a food license. If we wanted to pursue a brewery operation, just a pure manufacturing operation, we'd have to surrender our vittling license, and we're not even allowed to have that on the same site. That's a significant distinction.
But then I guess my confusion becomes, we're talking about two different lots, two different sites. Is that two different premises? Or can you brew on one side of the road and walk it across the street and serve it? But aren't we on different premises then? Which means it isn't a brew pub because the food's across the street.
No, it would have to.
Okay.
So the license would cover the area that the alcohol could be served, consumed in. And if it's defined. So you can't, and I don't think it's going across the street to another area. If there was a situation like that, then I'm sure that those limitations, those boundaries, those alcohol service areas would be clearly defined and identified. I guess that could happen, but it still would be subject to the licensing. And I think that's where I'm not explicitly familiar with the licensing component. I just know that it's a good fallback. It's another layer of review that happens annually that gives an opportunity to look at an operation to see, well, have there been adverse impacts?
Can I just interject? I don't mean to interrupt. So that was an issue that we also needed to explore with Department of Business Regulation. So one of the very specific requirements is that you submit your liquor license and liquor service area from the town to DBR for your licensing. So it has to be on the same premises. You're not allowed, it actually says in the regulation, you're not allowed to sell this anywhere but the licensed operation. So not only do we have to get state licensing, but we'll have to amend our liquor license to make sure the service area for this property includes where the brewing operation is occurring. And the only way we can sell this off-site is through a distributor. I mean, that's generally how it has to happen anyway.
So Susan, I hope again, once it goes off the licensed premises for the brew, where it's manufactured, it goes into a distribution model. So it can't, if Mr. Finnegan owns 6 restaurants, he can't brew and distribute to those 6 restaurants unless they were contained in his original license. And I'm highly unlikely that the business license would allow him to what is called distribute to 6 venues. He'd probably be limited to the one where he manufactures, because again, Rhode Island has a very tried and true system where you manufacture or you purchase and you have to go to the distributor, then the distributor brings it back to you.
So we don't have to buy it back.
Yeah, in some aspects, Mr. Finnegan may have to brew on one side of the street, send it to his distributor, and then buy it from the distributor for his other restaurant across the street.
That's right. Yeah, correct.
I understand that, but I guess I don't understand where in the town the brewing manufacturing portion will take place. Because it needs to take place on the same lot
Jay will
where there's
go
a
through-
restaurant.
Yeah, so what the recommendation is, and Jay will go through it, he has a story map. In essence, when we looked at the model, and Jay looked at the model, if you allow a restaurant that sells alcohol, we looked at all those zones. So the restaurant that sells alcohol would also be a restaurant that could have a brewery. And in most instances, those are in our commercial neighborhoods, and I believe some of our commercial highways, Jay. Correct? But a brewery, just a manufacturing of beer with a tap room, cannot go on the commercial highway or the commercial neighborhood. That's a brewery, goes somewhere else. Those are bigger, defined systems that are more industrial in nature, and they're not a small brew pub. So.
No, I'm not gonna. Oh, what happened? I'm broadcasting to the planning director's monitor downstairs. That's what's happening. Sure. Okay, so this was the story map that was sent around for those of you that got a chance to see it. Basically highlighted, this is existing conditions in Matunic with the commercial neighborhood zone and the R10 zone immediately behind it to the north, the open space lot where the beach is on the other side of the street. This represents what the applicant was attempting to do, proposing the CNM zone representing commercial neighborhood Matunic and leaving the rest CN. In looking at that, we felt that, there really wasn't, we understand how this concept came out, but in looking at it from the public perspective, if there could possibly be real benefit as an economic driver or more opportunity for economic development by allowing this in other zones. So am suggesting making the entirety of the former commercial neighborhood zone in Matunic the commercial neighborhood Matunic zone, being that it can be reflective of the unique character of Matunic and separate itself out from the other commercial neighborhoods in town that don't share similar characteristics. Looking at it a little further, I think we discussed a number of times that there was a split zone. There was a property that had a little bit of R20 on it and a little bit of commercial neighborhood on it. And again, we've recommended that in those instances we try to correct that so that it's one or the other. And we realized that the commercial neighborhood zone on Matunic Beach Road extended about 200 feet to the north, off of away from the ocean. And that obviously captured Mary Carpenter's and a large portion that is residential. That's always going to be residential. So the thought in our mind was the likelihood of a commercial use going in there and replacing those residential units is probably slim. I am not aware of a reason why it would be commercial neighborhood, particularly with the fact that it was just about exactly 200 feet, the whole curve. So it was like they went 200 feet off the road and just said, this is what it is. So our recommendation is to convert that to the R20 that's already behind it, where the majority of all the residential units are already occupied, and make it more consistent with current and future uses. Going a little further, we do recommend correcting there's some area down, I don't know if you can see my cursor. Yeah, where it's being converted. Also going up oh, this map won't move, but going up towards Holden Road area, all of those, there's a few lots and houses and the properties in there with frontage on the road that are residential in nature again, and the likelihood of them becoming commercial, we felt was low. Certainly not a deal breaker, but it was just something that we thought was a way of cleaning it up and making it more reflective of what the true intention of that area is going into the future. And there was a sliver in the middle of the roadway that kind of got taken out when we did that, so we just bumped the open space zone in the middle of the roadway right here. It really doesn't have any impact because the zoning of roadways, we don't really control uses in that manner, so it doesn't really have a large impact. So the question is allowing this type of use, and particularly the CN zone, what does that mean for the rest of the community, knowing that there are a number of CN zoning districts spot zoned all over the town. One of those being the Emporium at URI. The zoning officials advised me that those properties actually have prohibitions from the town council on alcohol, period. So they can't be used for the consumption of alcohol. I don't have the exact language, and Peter, I don't know if you do too, but alcohol consumption or service is not allowed on those lots. Moving over to the tower, Route 138, there's one lot, the furthest north, that has a restriction, and the other ones do not. Now, looking at this, you may say, well, at first, I had a concern being like, okay, so that's unrestricted. But knowing the area, would a restaurant that serves alcohol be appropriate there? And my logic would be, would it be appropriate to have a restaurant there that serves alcohol, a pizza place that serves beer? In my eyes, it would be yes. And could it accommodate a brew pub, much like what we're considering here? I think it's the same exact exercise that we're going through. And in our eyes, I think it makes a lot of sense. The vet hospital on Route 1, that's also prohibited from alcohol service or use. A number of properties in the vicinity of Kingstown Road, including the Pump House, Lily Pads Professional Center, the Peacedale Office Building, the intersection of Church and Columbia Streets, and the YMCA. A number of those are restricted, with the exception of the Pump House and the Peacedale Office Building. Currently, a restaurant with alcohol could open in compliance with our regulations in those locations. So the next question really is, what's the likelihood of that happening? And in my opinion, I think the likelihood would be low. Is there a chance? There's always a chance. Things change over time. But I don't really see that there would be any adverse impact from that. Again, they would have to get a special use permit, they would have to meet standards, and they would have to show that it can be accommodated within the existing restaurant and building footprint. Main and High Streets, there's a zone on the corner of Whitford and High Street, Columbia Street, Holly Street, and Highland Avenue. Of those, only the property on Holly Street is restricted. But again, these smaller zones located in the other areas, restaurants serving alcohol are currently allowed today. So there needs to be a level of comfort that there's a significant distinction between a restaurant that serves alcohol and a brew pub. And I don't feel that there is a significant enough one to distinguish the two. If we have a special use permit process in place with standards that need to be met and a local license that needs to be reviewed annually. South Kingstown Office Park is another commercial neighborhood zone that's also prohibited from alcohol-related uses. And Post and Ministerial, there's some properties on the corner of Post and Ministerial Road that they do not have any prohibitions. And lastly would be the proposed C&M zone in Matunic, which also does not have any prohibitions on alcohol use. So, the question really comes down to is there a distinguishable difference that would cause concern for a brew pub type use versus a restaurant that serves alcohol? And are there standards that can be put in place to help mitigate or overcome those differences? Or is they too drastic? Is it truly too different of an operation to be considered a restaurant that serves alcohol?
Difficult to look into that crystal ball. And I would imagine that if there were a public hearing relative to these areas, there would be concern, particularly Ministerial and Post Road, which is a very residential area, and Route 1, 138, hard to tell. That's been called the gateway to South Kingstown, but again, that opinion varies.
But I would encourage the board to focus on the distinction between the two type of uses. The distinction between a restaurant that serves alcohol and a restaurant that's a brew pub.
Right.
And considering them, considering a restaurant that serves alcohol that's got 100 seats and a brew pub that's got 100 seats, keeping all else equal, is there a concern? Is there a substantial difference between the two that would give cause for some concern?
I guess what comes initially to mind is, would a brew pub have more of an issue adjacent to a residential neighborhood with regard to smell, something like that?
Again, those would be all criteria contained within the special use. They're written into the regulation. So again, we even went down to the micro level. If you have a restaurant with a bar component and they don't sell tap beer and everyone's drinking out of a bottle, you have all that bottle storage. If you have a brew pub who's pouring directly out of a storage unit to a tap, you have glasses that get washed and you don't have the glass. But instead of the glass bottles that need to be returned and handled, you have the small manufacturing footprint of the brew pub. So I think, to Jay's point, trying to evaluate similar impacts, all of the zones that he referenced allow restaurants that serve alcohol as a component of the restaurant. So the only potential change is it's a restaurant that serves beer that has an additional manufacturing component. And to Maria's point, you need to offset smell, you need to offset storage of material, and you need to offset the movement of material within the site, all of which can be contained and controlled within the regulations.
And the size of the barrel would not be set in stone, it would be based on specific site criteria?
So the way the regs are written, just like I want to say most regulations, we use retail as the example. You allow in some areas buildings up to 50,000 square feet. But if you only have a 1 acre lot, you can't fit a 50,000 square foot building on the 1 acre lot, although your regulations allow you to go up to that. So everything has to be scaled based on the property. And Jay pointed out, even some of the properties contained within the commercial zone, there would be no way to accommodate a restaurant and parking on an existing lot. So those lots by default wouldn't be able to support a brew pub. They can't support a restaurant that serves alcohol. So again, a lot of it is scaled based on the parcels that would come before you. Now, I'd tune it to Applebee's in South County Commons. If Applebee's serves alcohol, if for some reason Applebee's failed or was bought by someone else and that became a brew pub, would that change the character of that neighborhood? Right? The infrastructure's there, the acreage is there, the land mass is there. That transition from a restaurant that serves alcohol to a restaurant that manufactures and serves beer that they brew, putting aside the handling of the byproduct and the movement of whatever grain or hops or wheat are used, what is the true impact? So, and that's for others than Jay and I or Brian to decide.
Well, in a large component of that, when I went through the exercise of looking at this, a large component of it had to do with the fact that I was thinking three-barrel system. 93 gallons. In my head, I'm thinking, okay, that's two 55-gallon drums in the corner somewhere, or some area that's representative of a very small footprint. If they can accommodate it in an existing restaurant, it just goes towards how they're not so distinguishable against each other, that it kind of fits in a restaurant atmosphere at a small scale.
So the reason for inclusion in IND 1 but not in 2 or 3 is related to restaurant? For a brew pub versus brewery?
Yes, well, the brewery component is a much larger scale
Right.
operation, a manufacturing facility that arguably, well, it should be in an industrial zone. It should be somewhere where
Yes, but
it's industrial.
But the reason for not also allowing a brew pub is the restaurant component? Because it's no in IND 2 and 3.
Let me look at that real quick.
Okay.
I think what we may have done is the saloon, the use code 56.2 for which was formerly saloon that we're replacing with brew pub, allowed it in a special use permit. I'll have to check that, but I think that's what it was. That there was already an allowance for saloons with via special use permit. I mean, that can easily be modified. I don't really. In our industrial zones, I really don't see a lot of opportunity or desire for someone to open a restaurant. Perhaps, but
In trying to understand all these distinctions, there's that new place that opened in South County Common across from the theater. I've not been in there, but is that a brewery or a brew pub?
So one of the things we discovered as we went through this process, and Jay pointed out, I believe at a previous meeting, is that there's no definition right now for brewery in the entire town of South Kingstown. So the breweries that you see were an interpretation by the zoning department that allowed food manufacturing. So under the zoning code, the one in South County Commons is not a brewery, it is a food manufacturer. So if I asked you to go through the zoning code and say, do you allow a brewery, someone would do a quick read, or you do a word search for brewery, brew, you wouldn't find that. And, you've heard me say this before, and we're trying to follow this, is that, we don't want to operate in these shades of gray. We're trying to make things as black and white as we can to eliminate unique interpretations to fit something that doesn't quite meet a definition. I think someone could argue that food manufacturing is not a brewery. You're not making potato chips, or you're not making cookies or some food product. You are making a beverage. And some towns even go to the point in their industrial zones that they define water bottling, water processing, beverage manufacturing, food manufacturing. They separate that. South Kingstown didn't, and at some point in time, someone interpreted the regs, that gray area, to say the manufacturing of beer is food processing.
So the addition of brewery as also a new use code would be to clarify.
Make it clear
Yeah.
that breweries are okay in South Kingston by definition, so long as you follow the permitting criteria and the standards contained in the regs.
But
So-
a brewery is just the place where the manufacturing happens?
Under the licensing for the state of Rhode Island, if you manufacture, if you have a brewery and you license that, you can have a tap room. So you can manufacture beer and you
And
can have,
serve it.
in essence, a tasting room.
To
But
answer
you
your,
can't serve food.
to answer your
But you
question,
can't serve food.
Can't serve food in a brewery or a tap room.
Okay.
I believe the location in South County Commons is being operated as a brewery. I've been there. They have no kitchen facility currently, and they are just serving alcohol accessory to the brewing operation.
Then again, that's the definition of our food manufacturing. So, food manufacturing doesn't allow you to have a restaurant inside your factory.
So I have a couple, does this include distillery, or is our distillery just a one-off because, like, does that also,
This does not, we did not touch on distillery whatsoever. The applicant originally asked for a number of, I think, 4 different uses, and in our memo, I explained that we chose to pare it down to just brew pub and brewery, since that was the testimony that we've heard, and that considering a distillery or a farm brewery or something like that would complicate the matter, and let's try to just be effective in our review and go and address what is actually being asked of.
so by not adding distillery somewhere in here, does distillery become food manufacturing?
Good question.
And then therefore allowed in other zones because we just don't address it?
Only allowed in
determination-
industrial, yeah.
But that determination would exist today, right now.
Yeah.
Right, but we're supposed to be cleaning up. Yes? No?
Moving forward, it may be an item we have to look at, but to Jay's point, we saw an opportunity
Yeah.
to fix one item that we knew was subject matter proper for this application, and again, did not want to complicate it, to Mr. Parker's point of developing new regulations for farm distilleries, which could have, how do you have a farm distillery in a commercial neighborhood zone, on a half-acre lot? I'm not quite sure where the farm goes, and where they're going to grow hops or grain.
So to go back to my question earlier, and I'm really not trying to just be obtuse. So to look at Matunic, the lot that we were specifically talking about at a previous meeting does not have a restaurant on it, but would need to have a restaurant on it to call it a brew pub, since you can't carry the beer across the road, right?
No, it does have a restaurant on it. The pizza.
Yes, it does.
Oh, so that's where it would be served. It wouldn't be served at a
Correct.
different restaurant.
Correct.
That's correct.
That's it. So the confines of the building.
Got it.
The confines of the building, most likely, in a normal situation, would probably be the service area established for the liquor license.
But isn't that lot that has the garage on it that we were talking about converting, the lot next door to the pizza lot?
No, it's part of, actually, where the garage originally was.
I think the garage is on a different lot.
Well, I can clarify. So
Okay.
way back when we first started this, one of the theories was we wanted to put something in front of the board to give you an idea of what Kevin was thinking at the time. The initial proposal, even when we met with staff over a year ago, was to move the garage that is on the neighboring property. You're correct. There is a garage there. It's 300 or 400 square feet in size. Pick that up and move it to the pizza shop lot. The practicality of that, it's just too complicated with floodplain regulations and lot lines and all those things. So that was scrapped. I mean, it's still a possibility, but that's not what's being proposed now. Then we talked about storage containers and things of that nature. So the garage idea is not included in this, or at least it's not being anticipated at this point. But the actual brew pub operation that we anticipate will be on the pizza shop lot that's already licensed, already has the infrastructure there. The only thing we would have to explore and establish is at the special use permit stage, come in with the plan, show you where it's going, what the equipment is, the storage, the materials, and you could see that on the site. But yes, it would be the pizza shop lot.
Clarifies so much for me. But while you're still here, the 7-barrel system, a barrel is essentially a keg? Is that the same size? Like, I'm sorry, I know exactly
Street
nothing
use,
about this.
people use keg, barrel. I have a barrel at my house, I have a keg. A half barrel of beer that you get at a liquor store, that's a half barrel. This is the terminology they use, or half a keg. That's 15.5 gallons, 15.5 gallons. In the manufacturing aspect of this, a beer guy, his relation to a barrel is 31 gallons. So even though that term barrel is thrown around, the confusion is, like they asked one person that worked for me today, and they asked my beverage manager, how many barrels do you go through? He said, 15. The beer guy thought, wow, you go through 15 31-gallon barrels. That's the confusion of the two people. So did I answer that? No.
No, so Susan, a half barrel, a keg that you would get for a college party is a half a barrel.
It's one item that's twice that size. That's a barrel.
Correct.
But so you're brewing and you're fermenting, you've got stuff. Can you give me an idea of a 7-barrel system? What's the real estate required? How big is a building? How much how much real estate are you talking about for a 7-barrel system? Like, how big is that operation?
I think 7-barrel systems are around 500 square feet.
Yeah, 500, 700 square. Oh, up to it's right here, so.
Because you looked at 5, 7, and 10.
Yep. So.
And does that include storage?
7-barrel system could be, you can change it. You can go fat and wide, or you can go skinny and tall. So you can go down to 1,000 square foot up to a 1,500 square foot. You got to, it's kind of like a kitchen on a yacht or a kitchen in a house. You got to make it work. But a barrel can be, 31 gallons could be skinny and tall, or short and fat. So if you have less footprint,
there is no potential definitive answer to that question. And there's a variation of size, probably in the range of 800 to 1,200 square feet for a 7-barrel system. And again, it's on the efficiency, the type, the investment. It's kind of like, to Mr. Finnegan's point, you can set them up in a galley setting, like a galley kitchen. You can set them up in a U-shape. You can set them up in an island scenario. But again, there's footprint. There's also storage of product, and then there's storage of product to make your batches, and whether you're just-in-time delivery or whether you're ordering a lot at once for bulk. So there's a lot of factors that go into it, and that's one of the points Jay looked at is, limitations on the barrel system to fit into their expression that it wouldn't be bigger than 1,200 square feet. So what system fits in that? And that's, comfortably, we knew comfortably 3 barrels with sufficient storage, sufficient product storage fit within that footprint.
Right.
But again, Mr. Finnegan can't say, or we can't say that a 7-barrel system takes up 932 square feet, because there's variations in what's available and what you purchase.
A question for you. Conington Brew, Admiral Kilburn Highway in Newport. Have you been there?
Yep.
And you go in there, it's a restaurant, it's a pub, burgers, fries. Behind the glass wall, there's some barrels. How big are those barrels, and how does that overall operation compare to yours? Do you have any
when
idea?
that first originally opened, one of the first in the state, they had the room, they spread it out, just like you're building a kitchen in a nice house, you got room, you got space.
Yep.
If you're on a yacht,
But the brewing operation and the barrels, how do they compare to what you're proposing?
I don't know what their size system is. I think that's more towards the manufacturing. As far as me judging, is that a 5, 7, 8, or 10? I don't know.
But it's probably as big or maybe slightly larger than what you're proposing?
I would say that's larger.
I mean, So, I'm trying to understand this, and truthfully, I'm not even sure where the big impacts are. I mean, I used to work in Newport and lived close by there, so it was a common lunch place or social activity after work. And from my perspective, you could pick up Connington Brew, Bob, and you could put it in Applebee's, you could put it in the Flats, you could put it in Matunic Oyster Bar. It would not change the character of any of those places. Just, that's been my experience, so.
I agree. When you were talking earlier, I agree with, if you were asking me the difference between a restaurant selling liquor or a brew pub, I would, run it the same. It's the same thing. If it was in my neighborhood or your neighborhood, either if you're allowing one, the other one's very similar. To your point.
Other questions, comments? I think to sort of summarize it, Jay, Jamie, are there any additional criteria that we need to explore or discuss prior to sending something forward to the council?
I think the applicant has been extremely patient. Again, it's a recommendation to the council, so be somewhat liberal on the timeframes. The only other thing that I think as we get to the council level that needs to be explored, and I've personally run into this as a planner through my years, is our understanding of what a restaurant is, and I think Mr. Finnegan understands what a restaurant is, but some future applicant with a savvy attorney standing next to him may have a different opinion of what a restaurant is. I had a recent experience with the distillery who defined his restaurant as a panini press and perhaps a soup pot is going to be his restaurant. So I think, to be clear, and again, I don't think Mr. Finnegan would have any objections to this if I have some language that, that it's a legitimate restaurant, and we need to kind of solidify the definition of that it is a restaurant capable of preparing food from scratch. And I had another experience with another type of alcohol manufacturer who wanted to bring in processed food and say, well, that's my restaurant, I'm serving food, I don't make it here, I reheat it here. Well, I don't want to say a normal person, but an average person would say that's not necessarily what I would view as a restaurant. So I think, in fairness to the applicant who understands what a restaurant is, that we solidify the language for what a restaurant is and needs to be established in order to have the brewery component within the restaurant, that it's not a panini press, it's not a microwave oven, it actually contains the components of a traditional restaurant. And again, in my conversations with Mr. Finnegan and knowing Mr. Landry, I'm sure they would have no objections to that.
Do board members feel comfortable with Jamie's addition to the definition of restaurant and moving this forward to the council?
Joe, I'm sorry, Maria, I'm just a little excited because the Connington Brewery website's got a picture. And you can't really see it, but on the tanks it says 7 BBL.
Is what?
It says 7 barrels.
Wow.
So it's basically the Connington Brewery.
But I believe, so 7 barrels would be 7 times 31, so 200 and some odd gallons. To me, that would be in each tank. Because each tank says, there's another picture here where the tank says 7 on the side here. So that might be a series of 7 barrel systems or whatever. I think we need to have just a better understanding of exactly what these look like, what the size is, what the footprint is. I think we should. We just need 48 hours for the agenda, that's all.
Well, back to my original question, do board members feel comfortable, or do they feel that more discussion is necessary prior to moving this forward to the council. The draft on page 9 is pretty brief. I think what's most helpful is the actual explanation of the amendments and the first 4 paragraphs in the memo.
Specifically, you're talking from in the brew pub section? Yeah.
Page 9. But Jay, there should be 2 sets of recommendations, correct? Or does this cover both?
I think there
It's
were,
pretty brief, but it appears to try to cater and...
when you say 2, you mean brew pubs and breweries?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it would be one motion, one consideration for both topics. And again, with the brewery side, with the brewery component, that is simply just putting a definition and a use in the ordinance that is currently being employed today.
But this particular draft motion does not address the, unless I'm missing something, the new zone. The creation of the new zone.
It's on page 8. If you look in the section 301 table, there's a new item for CN/M.
So Jay, can I ask you about the use table? Because some of it's 56.6 and some of it's 56.7. On the use table, say on page 8.
Page 8.
And on page 4.
Oh, that's a typo.
And then on this proposed amendment that we have, which is separate, it has the use as brewery or brew pub. Both of them are in the commercial neighborhood Matunic. On this one, I'm not sure what this is.
Oh, is that the applicant's submission?
Oh, I don't know.
Probably.
That's what it looks like. I think that is.
Yeah.
I think that's ours.
Yes, I
It
think
says
so.
proposed amendment at the top.
So for clarification, the brew pub should be use code 56.2 and brewery should be 56.6. I know there's a reference to a .7 in there.
But unless I'm mistaken, the draft motion begins on page 9.
I did not include necessarily a draft motion. The things at the end of that document were suggested changes to the zoning ordinance in regard to elimination of saloon. So there's hours of operation of certain businesses, section 9-19, where we're eliminating the reference to saloon, since we are proposing to take out the use code saloon and replace it with brew pub.
I'm not sure where you're,
Oh, am I in the wrong?
Madam Chair, if you give us a few moments, we can solidify a draft
Thank
motion
you.
for you. So, I have one, Jay.
So Jay, also on Appendix B, it says, "Commercial neighborhood with the following use codes prohibited: restaurant with alcohol, brew pub, liquor store. Do we need to also add brewery on that list also, on Appendix B, which is on page 9?
No, because it's not allowed, because it's not an industrial zone. Breweries are only allowed in the industrial zones.
And before you get too far along, when I read this draft, it seemed as though there needed to be a second draft relative to the new CNM zoning district, because it's in there as a reference, but again, Peter could probably advise us appropriately.
So
just
what I have in
seemed-
draft language is that the South Kingstown Planning Board hereby makes a favorable recommendation to the town council on the proposed zoning ordinance and map amendments based on an application submitted by Tidestorm LLC to amend the town's land use regulations to allow brew pubs as a special use in existing commercial neighborhood districts and new commercial neighborhood Matunic zoning district, and the addition of breweries as a special use in specific industrial zones as defined in this memo. And then there's findings of facts associated with that.
But
which
don't
are
you need
printed
a
now.
separate memo defining this new district? Because you refer to it here, but you don't have a separate...
If you go on, it is contained on page 7, I believe, of the memo.
Yes, 8, the top of the page, the red paragraph starts with CN-M, commercial neighborhood. That's the description, it's the definition.
Right, but that should be in the form of a specific recommendation rather than just information, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
So is this something that we can correct this evening, or should we ask for planning department to fix it? And
So my recommendation would be, if you're comfortable with the substance, this is a little bit different than a lot of the type of applications you'll hear, where you're sitting in a quasi-judicial capacity and you need to make sure you make detailed findings on every specific area that you're addressing. Here, you're just advising the council that's going to be acting in a legislative capacity, so they don't really, they could pass this for no reason at all, give no reason at all, or they could give a reason. Now, I think it's good policy to include that, but it's not the same level of detail that's required. So if you're comfortable making a motion to approve tonight with the substance that's been provided in Jay's draft, I think you could do that. And, you know, if you wanted to add a comment about changing anything, I don't think it's going to have any type of consequence, other than as long as you're accurately communicating to the council what you think. That's really the only issue, and it's not a legal issue.
Do we need to define exactly what the parameters would be? If it's a special use permit, in tandem, don't we have to also immediately define how you would be entitled to get that, you know?
Yes, so it's going to have standards. And, you know, you could, in your recommendation, you could get into the nitty-gritty onto each standard and make recommendations that certain things should be changed, or you could take a more general approach and either leave it up to staff and the council to hammer out what those standards will be. It's really just, it's a policy consideration for the board on what you want to recommend.
this even come from?
So the last page contains the draft motion. The last 2 pages, I'm sorry. So starting on the bottom of page 9 and continuing on to page 10. The only thing I will say in reference to this, there was some language added for the definition of restaurant, which I still think needs a little more vetting. And then during discussion, there was a reference to, instead of a 3, a 5 gallon, but I think you're potentially at a 7 gallon system now. So.
I think generally, even in a recommendation to the council, we have some kind of reference to the justification. There's a reference to the comprehensive plan. It just seemed as though the creation of the new zoning district was not particularly detailed to the same degree that the brew pub was. And maybe that isn't necessary, but...
New zoning district in the industrial, or?
No, the new commercial neighborhood Matunic.
So commercial neighborhood Matunic, in essence, is the existing commercial neighborhood with the expansion the applicant suggested. We've eliminated a few of the lots, to Jay's point. The front of the Matunic Beach condos would go to residential, along with, I believe, 2 of the lots to the north of that are primary residential and tiny as it relates to the rest of the zone. Again, if the planning board doesn't feel comfortable tonight, we can solidify a different style of motion at your direction.
So could I ask another question? So we are now permitting brew pubs in commercial neighborhoods all around town. What differentiates now Matunic commercial from the rest of town? Like now, why is it a different designation than any other, why is it different than any other commercial neighborhood now in town?
It was proposed, and partly because of the applicant's angle on it, how he was trying to establish a separate C&M zone just for that. And when we take a step back at it, you know, Matunic is clearly unique. It's different than everywhere else in town. We have a village plan for that, for Matunic. There are, I haven't gone through the list of uses, but I'm sure that there are uses that are allowed currently in the CN zone that would not be compatible in Matunic. And Matunic is CN currently.
Okay.
So the intent was to carve it out as its own unique CN zone where you could then guide the vision in the future for it a little bit better by saying, no, we don't want car dealerships, or pick whatever is in the ordinance that applies in other CN zoning districts that wouldn't apply here. Would give you a little bit of control and flexibility to make sure Matunic stays Matunic, and that it can be, land use regulations can be addressed there differently than they can be at the Emporium or at the towers on 108 and Route 1.
And what it does is, it's kind of preemptive. It's probably something that should have been done years ago. So when someone's before you and proposes a change for neighborhood commercial and Peacedale, you don't have to think about what's it do to Matunic. Matunic is now its separate classification. And vice versa, if you do something to Matunic that allows some kind of more water-related item, you don't have to worry about the implications or unintended consequences for something at the Emporium by URI, because you've made them two distinct zones.
But
Right, I think
what's,
he-
oh, I'm sorry, finish.
I think he originally pulled out Matunic as special because you didn't want to inadvertently have people brewing beer up at the Emporium. And that's why he designated, I think that's why it originally designated Matunic as special, so that it wouldn't imply that we could then allow this behavior in inappropriate places in town. But it turns out it's prohibited there anyway. But I understand your point about not inadvertently allowing something in Peacedale that jumps to Matunic. Got that. That's good. Okay. Sorry, Liz.
If you start looking at a trend, though, what's to prevent the trend of having a neighborhood zone with an initial at the end of it? I mean, why wouldn't we have a CNP for Peacedale?
You make a very good point.
But
Liz.
is that what let's think about that, because that's what this is starting to
I
head to.
think over time, and again, you have a older zoning code that was written many years ago. And as the town looked different then, right? And as the town has grown, I think the villages over time have even become more distinct as a result of that growth. And it is possible that at some point that you look at your zones, commercial highway, for example. Commercial highway in one part of town on 108 is completely different than what you allow on commercial highway near Old Tower Hill, but yet they're the same zone. So I think it's a good point. In most municipalities, there may be 5 village districts, not one, because they are in some aspect distinct. One may support 10,000 square foot buildings, and the other one, the biggest commercial building you want is 2,000 square feet. So in South Kingstown presently, there isn't that broad distinction. Everything was pretty much painted with the same brush.
But if we're heading that way, if there's a chance we're heading that way, let's do it thoughtfully. Let's not just fall into it. And so I think that based on what Susan said, if the CN-M is a different zoning district, do we want that? Do we need that based on what we've just talked about? Because it does imply that that's going to happen in the future to other neighborhoods.
And is it not just a special management zone? We could have called 108 in up toward Kingston the commercial highway and then some code, because it's different.
Like an overlay district?
Yeah,
Is that what you're talking
basically this is an overlay district. Yes?
Well, and all of the points that have been raised, I think simply point to the fact that anything that we send to the council needs to be clear, understandable, justified by the criteria that we normally deal with. I mean, in the staff memo, there's this odd sentence, but it makes sense. Staff opines that all of these types of uses, if considered, could amplify potential concerns and complicate other considerations associated with these other proposed uses.
And that was in reference to the distilleries and the farm brewery. So that was where we made the distinction in saying, you have a request before you that includes 4 uses, distillery and farm brewery included. And because of the testimony that we heard and the objective of what the applicant was trying to achieve, we just singled those out, the brew pub and the brewery, so that the other 2 components didn't complicate what the applicant really was trying to achieve.
Yes, and I support what the applicant is trying to do. I think we just need to be careful where it could happen in other parts of town and having appropriate standards and criteria and what's the impact. And I'm sure that conversation would happen at the council level. But again, we need to be clear when we send this type of motion to the council, because they don't always deal with the complicated issues that we do to the same extent.
The only thing I can say is Jay spent, I don't want to say hundreds of hours, but hours diligently going through all of the potential ramifications of each individual property contained within the zone. He didn't just turn on commercial neighborhood on the GIS and leave it at that. There was an in-depth view and analysis of each zone and the implications to them. He didn't just turn on the area by URI, because if he did, he wouldn't know that there were prohibitions there. So he looked at the implications of each zone, the probability that it would occur or not occur within those zones, to have a comfort level to make a recommendation that it was potentially appropriate in all of the commercial neighborhoods, because of the likelihood based on the land massing size and prohibitions that exist, that there would not be unintended consequences. And if there were, you still had a permitting process available to you in the special use process to mitigate those impacts. So it wasn't just toggling on
No,
the
I
GIS
think
layer.
we understand and we appreciate it. And by the way, the link that you sent to us for the story map, when I clicked on the link, all I got was text. I didn't have the underlying map. So I thought, this is kind of strange, but I don't know if everyone else got the map.
I got the whole thing.
Oh, I didn't get the map for some reason. Strange.
Thank you. And I just
Yeah, it's very well done.
In the end, I just want to say, like, going through this, the common thing that I kept coming back to was, what's the distinguishing factor between an a restaurant serving alcohol and a brew pub? And I would think, okay, if you had a restaurant that had a relatively large seating area that was struggling and couldn't utilize all that seating area, and maybe the seating area was a room off to the side that they could break out. If they were able to accommodate a small, become a brew pub and be able to accommodate a 3-barrel system or whatever, giving up some of that space, giving them another opportunity to generate revenue and establish a presence or a brand. What is the distinction between them operating as a restaurant, serving a bottle of beer over the counter, versus what they can make in the room? What is the concern? And it was really hard for me to come up with something. I mean, yes, the smell, but on a small system, I believe that it's nominal enough that natural ventilation would carry it away, and it would not be an impact. And there are things that we do need to feel more comfortable with, but I think for the substance of the discussion, there was enough there to assess whether it was a reasonable request.
So how comfortable are board members with sending this forward to the council, and is there a way that we could preface this motion with several paragraphs of what the concerns were for this board in our conversation this evening, so that the council would have an understanding of what we were thinking as they look at this?
I would ask the board to come to consensus with what exactly those concerns are, so we're clear when we write the motion, when we write the recommendation, exactly what those are. We've touched on a few. There's still some things that are not clear to everyone, including staff, regarding sizing of the system and what that actually means. But the concerns, if they're articulated, would be very helpful for us in coming up, because it's difficult to have a conversation like this with a lot of questions and then being able to come back and saying, well, this is what they meant. I think anybody in that situation would struggle difficulty with this topic. I mean, we've kind of bounced around a little bit.
Yes.
And to Jay's point, we've heard a lot of conversations, but I haven't heard a definite. If you ask me to modify this motion and include our concerns, I've heard discussion, but I haven't. You can't make a list.
Yeah, the
of
only
any, based on
concerns,
any of the discussion.
first of all, I think the first 4 paragraphs do explain clearly the purpose of the motion. I read that and it clarified it for me. What I think could use some further clarification are the definitions of brew pub and the definitions of brewery and the definitions of a restaurant. That is, I think there's still some fuzziness. I think somebody reading this for the first time is going to go back and forth and back and forth.
We included the definition of brewery and the definition of brew pub in there, and we did not make that up. We actually stole it. I think it came from East Greenwich. And I think it was also suggested by Matt. Matt suggested it first, and then I went looking on my own, and I came up with East Greenwich too, and I was like, okay, I guess we'll go with that.
Remember the difference between cannabis and marijuana and how much we struggled with the difference there?
That's because the state used those two different terms versus just saying recreational marijuana and medical marijuana. That would have been so much simpler.
But when they started to look at implications throughout specific zones, it became a more complicated conversation. And as you recall, changed several times. Can we add that specific criteria needs to be added?
What type
For-
of specific? What?
For the brew pub? The checks and balances or guardrails, whatever you want to call them.
That is referenced
Which
in the memo, is it not? Are you saying that they're not satisfactory, or?
I think just a reference to it in the motion. I mean, there's a lot of information leading up to this, and
So at the bottom.
trying to consolidate some of it into, or at least make a reference to it into the motion so that it's clear.
Sure. Yeah, so the standards start at the bottom of page 2 and extend standards 1 through 9 that go on to page 3 for brew pubs.
So it just should be referenced in the, I mean, there's a lot of material here.
So a specific reference to standards. So I have 2 items. Is there anything else? And again, we'll try and assimilate some of the discussion.
Sure.
Clean up the motion
That would be great.
and have it for your regularly scheduled meeting in June.
Obviously, as soon as possible, because the applicant has been at this for a while and wants to move it forward. Sure.
Came up earlier, I will also be here on June 11th, if that's helpful. I have a couple of things that night, but I leave it to the board. Thank you.
Again, just understanding, a meeting in 2 weeks doesn't give staff 2 weeks. It literally gives us 3 days. So
Whatever you can do.
We'll do our best.
Yeah, whatever you can do. Is everyone okay with that? Okay. Anything else from anyone? Let's move on then, because it is 10 o'clock, and theoretically, that is our end time with a 6:30 start.
Thank you very much for your time and your diligence, and thank you especially to staff for your help with this. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Next agenda item is advisory zoning text amendment, People's Credit Union. Jamie, do you want to give us just a very brief overview of?
Yeah, just, I don't want to oversimplify the application, but the People's Credit Union is here with a application to go back to what you had a little over 6 months ago.
Yep.
Which allowed drive-throughs associated with financial institutions. As you remember, the changes in the legislation alluded to the fact that if you don't have specific standards associated with your special use
Correct.
categories, that those special uses would be allowed by right because you had no standards to weigh an application against. So the planning board, as they did with many use categories that lacked standards, just put a no next to them. So they are asking to reinstate the drive-through as a special use, and they have included standards associated with the criteria, which would allow special use permits for drive-throughs for financial institutions. So I hope I didn't oversimplify that, but representatives are here tonight, so I don't know if they have anything to add.
It's a pretty simple request. I think those planning board
I know
members
Mr. Callahan's here.
who were here for that 3-hour session going through the entire zoning understand the use table. But again, if anyone has any questions, now is the time. And if folks from the bank would like to speak to this.
Sometimes it's better just to be quiet.
And again, Madam Chair, if this is something the planning board is comfortable with, this one, I believe we could have a motion for
Yes.
the 11th.
Okay. You don't, I wondered why there wasn't a motion this evening on page 2, because there's a little paragraph about it,
They were,
and then it said findings
they're
and motion.
placeholders.
Okay. Are folks in agreement that we should move forward with this and have it at our next meeting? Would someone like to make a motion to ask staff to draft that motion?
I'll make that motion.
We have a motion from Liz. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
A second from Caper. Any further discussion?
I have a quick question.
Go ahead.
So we've now made drive-throughs not allowed, except this kind of drive-through with a special permit.
So
So the next restaurant that comes that wants to do some kind of walk-up window, it's going to be just a no? Or are we going to revisit that then?
you would revisit that then and determine whether you want more restaurants with drive-up windows, which you would be acting or making a recommendation to the town council, which is acting legislatively, and they have broad discretion to say yes, no, or with modifications. So,
And Chair Mack, before you vote, I was wondering if there's possibility that you could consider this motion, if it's a recommendation tonight, because what happened was we were here before you in November, the statute changed in December, we came back in January for pre-app again with changes, and we realized at that point that the ordinance had been adjusted. So Peoples is trying to move,
Yeah.
not as fast as they can, but with some
I mean,
speed.
I don't see why not, if staff can come up with the language that, it's a pretty simple request. I don't know how everyone else
So-
feels. I mean,
I think you could just make a generic motion to find that the request as proposed is consistent with the comprehensive plan and consistent with the general purposes of zoning as outlined in the Zoning Enabling Act. I don't think you need to get in any specifics. It's just a blanket form motion and move it on to the council.
I don't think I've ever heard you use that term, generic motion, but,
he meant to say simplified.
yes, simplified. Would someone like to make that motion? We have a motion from Joe. Do we have a second?
Second.
Second from Liz. Any further discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Motion carries. Thank you. Thank you very much. Last agenda item, public hearing, discussion, and possible action on amendment to the subdivision and land development regulations to remove and eliminate section 15 forms and checklists in its entirety and all associated references to said section. Jay?
Yes, board members, if you recall, last time we discussed this, we arranged for a public hearing to amend the subregs. The intent is to remove the applications and checklist formally from the subdivision land development regulations and leave them under the purview of the administrative officer, with the intent that any changes to the applications or checklist will be reported to the planning board in their report from the AO. In your packets, there is a summary page that shows the cleanup of all the items. Basically, all we're doing is eliminating that section and eliminating all references throughout the sub-regulations that reference Article 15. So we would still have applications, we would still have checklists. They simply will just come out of the subregs. And the intent of that was to provide a little bit of flexibility for staff to be able to adjust to pertinent changes to applications based on the changes to state law and our general processes, how we process applications. It gives us a little more flexibility to make sure that we can change the things that we need to change in a timely manner.
We really do need that increased flexibility, not only because of the changes to state law, but in our ongoing efforts to be efficient and flexible as well. Does anyone have any questions for Jay on this? This is a public hearing. Is there anyone who wishes to speak? You're the only one in the audience, so I kind of figured.
I don't know if it's on. Brent White. I had a question. I received a letter this week, and I just want to know previous approved plans, how long those are, valid for, coming from you guys. Like, I've been before this group a long time ago, and Maria's the only one, I believe, that's still here. Maybe. And the thing, the development will come up next time, but I'm just asking from the letter I received, like, how long do those plans last?
Depends on the type of plan. If it was a master plan approval from a long time ago, chances are it's lapsed, because you have to factor in, there was tolling until 2017. The master plan statute allows for a 2-year expiration period with the right to request 2 one-year extensions. So if you haven't requested the extensions, all master plans would expire by 2019. But there's different expiration periods depending on what the plan was.
Generally, I would say, as a general answer to that, I would say 2 years with extensions of 1 year twice, and the ability of extending it longer if the applicant can explain why.
And there was a letter from the planning board, because I'm an abutter for 571 Main Street. So, this is coming up. It was a long time ago. So I will, from our first conversation, the first conversation you had today, like, if you look back on those things, there's not a lot of meat to those, right, those things that you brought up, those meetings. And I spent some time, and Madam Chair, you did too. So, all right, I'll come back next time.
Thank you for coming out tonight.
All right, thank you.
Would someone like to make a motion to close the public hearing?
I'll make a motion to close the public hearing.
We have a motion from Liz. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Second from Susan. Any further discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Motion carries. We do have a draft motion, a very brief one, on the first page of the proposed amendments. Someone would like to make that motion?
remove it, where does it go?
It just becomes an administrative document. It's just, we've incorporated the administrative documents into the formal subregs, so when that happens, you have full authority over the subregs, so any modifications or anything would require a public hearing to change the application. Like, if we wanted to add somebody's middle name to the application, we'd have to come to the planning board, have a public hearing to make that change.
Or if you wanted 10 copies versus 8 copies, we'd actually have to have a public hearing. If we wanted to add, you need to show your butters map on 8.5 by 11 versus 11 by 17, we would need to come to you. So we're just trying to handle this and react much quicker
Right.
on the administrative side.
Yeah, practical and more efficient.
So right now, none of the meat of it's going to change, it's just moving.
None of the, at this point, none of the applications or the checklists are changing based on your motion right now. Your motion is to give that authority to the administrative officer, the planning department administrative officer, who will then report out to you at the next meeting what changes have been incorporated.
I'll make that motion. The South Kingstown Planning Board hereby amends the Town of South Kingstown subdivision and land development regulations to remove Article 15, forms and checklists in its entirety, as well as any and all references to the same within the subdivision and land development regulations.
We have a motion from Joe. Do we have a second?
I second.
Second from Caper. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Motion carries. And that concludes our meeting for this evening. Are we set for TRC? Or we're not there yet?
We will need a representative.
We do need
What's the
one.
date?
Yeah, because we will meet before the next work session.
Can you give us the date?
Wednesday, June 12th.
Wednesday, June 12th. It can be your choice of morning or afternoon, if anyone would like to volunteer. Excellent, thank you.
Anybody else want to do it?
Before we adjourn, just a quick announcement.
Microphone, Joe.
Before we adjourn, just a quick announcement. The Affordable Housing Commission has an upcoming meeting. I believe it's June 5th, Brian. And it is with bringing in the Women's Development Corp. and Habitat for Humanity, and possibly another agency to discuss affordable housing. This is a similar, if not a follow-up meeting to the one we had in the past, which was a joint one with Narragansett. The last meeting was very, very informative, and they are trying to get as many stakeholders as possible to attend the meeting. If it is anything like the last one, it would be very informative, I think, to planning board members, both on what they're working on, but also topics come up that I think come into our deliberations and considerations when we have an applicant in front of us.
Thanks, Joe. I think Brian just sent that email out yesterday, was it?
Yeah, I did yesterday or the day before, and I'll add to Joe, that meeting that we had with them with Narragansett was a fantastic meeting. The town manager even popped in and out of it, thought it was great, and they'll talk about a lot of things that will be interesting, the kinds of properties they try to size up for their developments, I'll call it financial witchcraft that they do with tax credits and stuff like that to pay for these things. So I think it would be very informative, and I would hope anybody who's available can attend.
Thanks, Brian.
It's at 7 o'clock next Wednesday in the chambers, June 5th.
Motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Motion carries. Thank you, everyone.